What if your child calls you, Dad? But the DNA says otherwise? What if the woman you loved didn't cheat just once? She planned a life, and you were never part of that plan. These are not just stories of infidelity. They are stories of children born from lies, of men who found the truth too late, and of love that survived the betrayal, or shattered because of it. Welcome to Infidelity Chronicles, Born from Betrayal, where paternity isn't just biology. It's a battlefield of truth, silence, and survival. The morning sun filtered gently through the linen curtains, casting golden stripes across the polished wooden floor of the Davis home. It was the kind of morning that novels romanticize and memory preserves, soft, slow, and deceptively peaceful. The faint hum of the coffee machine in the kitchen sang a lullaby to the waking house. And the clinking sound of a spoon against ceramic blended seamlessly with the rustling of pages from a newspaper. It was a symphony of domestic tranquility. Martin Davis, 35, sat at the head of the dining table, barefoot, dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and work pants still creased from yesterday. His fingers were calloused from years of construction work, but they handled the newspaper delicately, as if searching for something more meaningful than headlines, perhaps a reassurance that the world outside matched the peace he felt inside his home. His face bore the kind of lines that don't come from age, but from responsibility, the kind of quiet burden that turns a man into a protector, a provider, a constant. Yet, behind his mild blue eyes, there was always a spark of gentle wonder, a romantic streak Olivia often teased him about. He had built bridges and stadiums, poured concrete across highways, but nothing felt more permanent, more real, than the breakfast table before him. Across the room, Olivia moved gracefully between the fridge and the stove, humming faintly to herself as she flipped pancakes for their 6-year-old son, Dylan. She was 33, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could soften any tension, calm any storm. She moved with the ease of someone who had found her rhythm in motherhood. And to any stranger, the sight would have been cinematic, something straight from a home insurance commercial. But perfection is often the most beautiful disguise. Martin adored Olivia, always had, from the first moment they met at a friend's backyard barbecue. A warm evening tinged with grilled smoke and the scent of cheap beer. She had captivated him. Not because she was the loudest or the most striking, but because she radiated a kind of quiet control. He was drawn to her steadiness, the way she spoke with intention, how she laughed with her whole body. She made him feel safe in a world that rarely offered men like him softness. They married within a year, too fast, some said, but to Martin, it had felt inevitable. Olivia, a former literature major who once dreamed of publishing poetry, had given up her ambitions for stability, or so he believed. She slipped into domestic life like she had been preparing for it her entire life. And when Dylan arrived, everything snapped into place. The tidy house, the family photos, even the golden retriever their son named Comet. But even in the most tranquil waters, some currents run deep. There had been a moment, shortly after Dylan's birth, when Martin had asked, casually, if they should get a DNA test done, not because he suspected anything, but because of an article he read about rare blood incompatibilities and how early knowledge could save lives. Olivia had laughed, not nervously, not with hesitation, but with a softness that made Martin feel foolish. She brushed a hand through his hair and said, "You're always thinking like an engineer, solving problems before they happen." The next day, she handed him a document, an official-looking lab report, blood type confirmation, paternity 99.9% assured. He hadn't pushed further. He wasn't that kind of man. Suspicion wasn't in his nature, and trust had always been his default. But Evelyn never fully did. Evelyn Davis, Martin's mother, was a woman sculpted by precision. A retired biology teacher, she had spent decades teaching high school students to trust data, not feelings. She was polite but distant with Olivia, not cold, but cautious, as if her instincts, honed by a lifetime of empirical thinking, couldn't be lulled by a charming daughter-in-law or the warmth of a baby's giggle. She loved her grandson deeply, but she stared at him too long when he laughed, as if cataloguing every deviation. She never said anything, not even when Dylan's eyes turned out hazel while both Martin and Olivia claimed blue-eyed parents. Not when he began to show a dimple on the left cheek, an exact replica of Daniel, Olivia's college boyfriend, whose photo once sat, oddly framed, in her childhood bedroom. Martin had noticed it the first time he visited her parents' home. But after their engagement, it mysteriously disappeared. He never asked. Perhaps he didn't want the answer. He didn't have a reason to. Olivia loved him. Dylan adored him. Their life was enviable, quiet, structured, full of soft rituals and reliable joys. Pancakes on Sunday, walks with Comet in the park, afternoon games of catch that ended in laughter. But real things cast shadows. And some shadows are made not by the absence of light, but by the truth someone works tirelessly to obscure. That morning, Martin leaned forward to kiss Olivia's cheek as she set the pancakes down. She smiled, the same smile that had anchored him through layoffs and long weeks. Dylan ran into the room, barefoot and laughing, leaping into Martin's lap with syrup-covered fingers. Martin wrapped his arms around the boy, feeling the familiar weight of fatherhood. He laughed, ruffling Dylan's soft hair, not knowing that beneath that grin, so full of life and trust, a storm had already begun to form. A storm seeded not in malice, but in a moment of fear 6 years ago. A moment Olivia thought she had buried beneath a document and a warm smile. But truth has a pulse, and it was starting to beat louder. It began with bruises that shouldn't have lingered. Dylan came home from school one afternoon with a scrape on his knee and a faint purplish patch on his arm that hadn't been there that morning. Olivia brushed it off. He'd fallen, maybe bumped into something, but over the next few weeks, the bruises multiplied. Some appeared without cause, others darkened too quickly, spread too far. Martin started to notice how winded Dylan became after light running, how pale his skin turned under the sun, and how he'd often come home too tired to finish dinner. There was something beneath the surface, something that refused to be ignored. Then came the fevers, short, violent bursts of heat that left Dylan shivering in sweat-soaked sheets in the middle of the night. Olivia would sit beside him, wiping his forehead, singing lullabies half remembered from her childhood, while Martin paced outside the room, fingers clenched and jaw locked. For a man who solved structural equations for a living, who measured stress loads and reinforced beams, this was unbearable. Here was a problem he could not fix. One night, Dylan collapsed in the schoolyard. The call came from the principal, and Martin's world narrowed to a tunnel of flashing sirens and sterile hospital corridors. They moved fast, blood tests, spinal taps, long words with Greek roots and Latin endings. Words like pancytopenia and marrow failure. When the hematologist finally sat him down, the air in the room felt heavier than lead. "Your son has aplastic anemia," she said. "His bone marrow isn't producing the blood cells he needs. He'll require transfusions, but long-term, he needs a bone marrow transplant, preferably from a relative." Martin didn't hesitate. "Test me, I'll donate whatever he needs." He said it with the certainty of a father who never doubted his role, who had read bedtime stories, fixed scraped knees, built backyard treehouses. But biology has no regard for stories. The results came back the next morning. "Your blood types don't match. Not even close." Martin blinked. "That can't be right. I'm O positive." The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Dylan is AB." There was a pause that stretched so long it carved itself into Martin's spine like a knife. It wasn't just incompatible, it was impossible. He stumbled back into the hallway, past the nurses and the vending machine and the antiseptic smell of false hope. He didn't know why, but his feet took him to a bench near the chapel. He sat, phone in hand, and called his mother. "Something's wrong," he said, voice hoarse. Evelyn didn't gasp or offer reassurances. She listened, then she asked a simple question. "Do you want the truth, Martin, or do you want comfort?" "The truth," he whispered. "Then I'll get it for you." 3 days passed in quiet agony. Olivia stayed by Dylan's side, exhausted but devoted, reading books in soft voices, adjusting his blankets. Martin watched her, watched the woman he loved become someone unrecognizable. Her eyes darted more. She jumped when he entered the room. She didn't ask him how he was holding up. Then Evelyn handed him a manila envelope. Her face unreadable. Inside, 2 stapled lab reports. DNA analysis. 1 strand from Martin, 1 from Dylan. Paternity probability, 0%. His heart didn't shatter, it disintegrated. Martin walked into the hospital room with the envelope in his hand. Olivia looked up from Dylan, eyes bloodshot and tired. "You lied to me," he said. She didn't move. "Tell me who he is." She closed her eyes, took a breath that looked like it hurt. Daniel, a name from the past. A ghost with a face. Daniel, Olivia's college sweetheart. Martin had seen a photo once. In a drawer she thought he wouldn't open. A man with deep-set eyes and that same lopsided dimple Dylan had. He died in a car crash 6 years ago. A closed casket funeral. Martin had driven Olivia to the service. She hadn't cried until they got home. Back then, he thought it was grief for a friend. Now he knew better. It was one night, Olivia said. "You were on a site inspection in Denver. He was in town. We met for coffee. It just happened. I thought it was over. But then he died, and I realized I was pregnant a week later." Martin sat down, not because he was weak, but because the weight of betrayal was too much to carry standing up. "I couldn't tell you," Olivia said. "I didn't even tell Daniel. He died before I had the chance. And you were so excited. I couldn't take that from you." Martin looked at the sleeping boy. Dylan's face was peaceful, oblivious, but Martin saw the truth now, etched into the lines of that little face. In the curve of his smile. In the way he laughed with abandon. Like someone who had never had to lie. "You took that from me anyway," Martin said. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Outside, machines beeped. Nurses called names. Life continued. But inside the room, everything had stopped. He could still feel Dylan's arms around his neck. Still hear the boy's voice yelling, "Daddy, watch this," from atop the jungle gym. Still remember the first time Dylan fell asleep on his chest. A tiny heartbeat fluttering like a bird against his ribs. The test said he wasn't the father. But his heart refused to believe it. And now he was left with a truth that had no shape, only pain. He didn't know what to do with it. Not yet. But one thing was certain. The body never lies. And once you know the truth, it demands something of you. A reckoning. The days following the revelation were a blur of clinical updates, exhausted silences, and unspoken conversations stretched tight across every room. Martin couldn't sleep in the hospital recliner anymore. Not next to her, not after the truth had hollowed out their shared world. He moved into a guest lounge. The kind meant for out-of-town relatives and broken hearts. Evelyn brought him fresh clothes and sat with him in heavy silence, only speaking when words were necessary. On the 3rd day, she placed a hand on his knee. "You have to think about next steps," she said, "not just for him, but for you." Martin nodded. His voice was hoarse. "I want a divorce." Evelyn didn't blink. She had been waiting for it. Not hoping, but knowing. She had seen too many students in her classroom with eyes full of confusion and parents who smiled too wide. She knew what deception looked like in the aftermath. But Olivia wasn't finished. That evening, she waited for Martin outside Dylan's room, her face blotchy with dried tears and exhaustion. "Please," she said before he could pass. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But you have to believe me. Daniel never knew. He never got to know. I kept it from everyone. Even myself. For a long time." Martin didn't answer. He just looked at her. Really looked. This was the woman he had built his life around. And now all he could see were the cracks she had hidden so well. The next morning, a manila envelope was delivered to the hospital addressed to Martin. Inside was a formal letter from a law firm and a notarized document. A last will and testament. From Daniel Whitaker. Martin sat down slowly, hands trembling as he unfolded the pages. The language was formal but direct. In the event of my death, should it be revealed that I have a child, I request legal guardianship be offered to Martin Davis. I owe Martin my life. 10 years ago, he pulled me from a burning car on the I-405. We never spoke after that day, but I never forgot it. If I cannot raise my child, I want him to. Martin stared at the page until the words blurred. His lungs refused air. He remembered the night clearly now. A car flipped. Smoke. Flames. He had been driving home late from a project site. Saw the wreck. Pulled over. Sprinted into fire. He hadn't known the man's name then. Daniel had been unconscious, slumped behind the wheel. The paramedics arrived. Martin had disappeared before anyone could take his name. He hadn't needed thanks. And yet here it was. A message from the grave. The coincidence was staggering. The universe, it seemed, was folding in on itself. He read the letter again. Not as a legal document, but as a confession, as a benediction, as a curse. If I have a child, let him be raised by Martin. Martin folded the letter with deliberate care. The lines between betrayal and fate blurred. Dylan, asleep in a room down the hall, carried the blood of a man Martin had saved. A man Olivia had once loved. A man who had unknowingly tethered them all together. He stood, eyes stinging. Olivia found him hours later. In the hospital chapel. You saved him, she whispered, and now you're saving his son. Martin didn't answer. He couldn't yet define what this meant. Love, responsibility, guilt, or something older, deeper. A reckoning owed to the past. All he knew was this. Everything he believed about his family had changed. But Dylan hadn't. And maybe, just maybe, that was where something real could begin again. Or end completely. Martin stood in the sterile hallway. The faint scent of disinfectant lingering like memory. The divorce papers were folded in his coat pocket, unsigned. Every time his fingers brushed the envelope, they recoiled like they had touched fire. He had played the scenario 1,000 times in his mind, packing his bags. Walking away, leaving behind a woman who had betrayed him and a child who wasn't his. Only it wasn't that simple anymore. Dylan lay in a hospital bed down the hall, small and pale beneath blankets that seemed too heavy for his 6-year-old frame. Machines beeped and sighed beside him, mapping his fragile pulse. Martin sat in the corner of the room most nights now, watching his son, no, Daniel's son, sleep, but the distinction felt increasingly abstract. Because in every breath, in every small smile Dylan gave when half awake, Martin saw something deeper than blood. He saw history. He saw a life shared. He saw himself, but Olivia's voice still echoed in his mind. Raw from their last argument. I never meant to destroy us, she had said, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. You were gone, I was lost, and when I realized, when I knew it was Daniel's baby, I thought I could bury it. I thought if I loved you enough, it wouldn't matter. You didn't give me the choice, Martin had said. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut like steel. You lied from the beginning. Then let me go, she had whispered. If you can't forgive me, I won't fight you. Just don't punish him for my mistake. Later that night, Martin returned to Dylan's room. He didn't realize the boy was awake. Dylan looked at him, eyes wide and quiet. Dad, he said, using the word like a question. Am I not yours? Martin froze. The air was suddenly thicker. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. His son. You heard something, Martin said slowly. Dylan nodded. You and Mom were fighting. You said, I was Daniel's. Martin didn't speak for a long time. Outside, the night nurse passed by. Humming softly, he turned back to Dylan, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. What matters, Martin said, is that you're mine now. And I'm not going anywhere. Dylan blinked, as if trying to process something too big for his years. Then he nodded and turned his face into the pillow. Silent but calm. After Dylan drifted to sleep, Martin stayed by the bedside, staring at the boy's features. The dimple on his left cheek. The way his hands curled in sleep. He remembered Daniel's photo, the one in Olivia's drawer. The resemblance was undeniable, even in the smallest things. The way Dylan held a spoon. Or how he crossed one leg over the other when reading. The next morning, Olivia met him outside the room, holding a pen and the divorce papers. Her hands trembled as she offered them. "If this is what you need to heal, I won't stop you," she said. "I just asked to see him, to be his mother." Martin took the papers, looked at them, then looked at her. "You don't get to make this simple," he said, "but it doesn't have to be cruel either." He tore the papers in half. Olivia gasped. "You're staying?" He shook his head. "I'm not staying for you," Martin said. "I'm staying for him, for Daniel, for what he asked of me. And because Dylan doesn't deserve to be punished for a truth he never chose." She said nothing. There was no victory in her eyes. Only relief twisted with guilt. Martin walked back into the hospital room and sat down by Dylan again. This time not as a man uncertain of his place, but as a father who had made a decision. Blood could define biology, but love, sacrifice, and memory would define something else entirely. Family. The house was smaller, quieter, the kind of place where cicadas hummed in the evenings and neighbors nodded from porches instead of waving from behind steering wheels. Martin chose it for that reason. The noise of the city had always been background, until it became unbearable. Here, on the edge of a sleepy town framed by fields and trees older than memory, he could breathe again, and more importantly, so could Dylan. The boy had recovered slowly. Transfusions, medications, checkups every month, but the light had returned to his eyes, the color to his cheeks. He'd grown an inch that year. His hair was longer, his laughter was louder, and Martin, somehow, was still standing. They had built a new life. Quiet routines, morning oatmeal with too much cinnamon, evening walks with flashlights pointed at frogs and tree roots. Dylan had a hammock now, where he read books upside down and asked too many questions about the stars. Martin had learned to answer what he could, and admit what he couldn't. But one question lingered in the air between them, never spoken directly again, the question of whose blood Dylan carried. Martin never lied, but he didn't confirm, and in that silence, something softer grew between them. Each year, on Dylan's birthday, Martin made a chocolate cake from scratch. It was never perfect, too dry one year, too sweet the next, but Dylan loved them. After they sang and unwrapped gifts, Martin would set 2 candles on the cake, one for Dylan, and one more, unlabeled. The boy never asked, he just watched his father light both, eyes reflecting something solemn for a child so young. Martin never explained the second candle, but he placed it with a reverence that Dylan seemed to understand. At night, Martin told him stories, not fairy tales, but real ones, of bravery, of moments when someone stepped up even when they were afraid. He taught Dylan CPR, how to splint a broken arm, how to listen when someone's voice cracked with unshed tears. Lessons wrapped in bedtime rituals. He called it the quiet code. Dylan once asked, "Why do we have to learn all this stuff, Dad?" Martin had smiled. "Because one day, you might be the reason someone else survives." There was a photograph on Martin's desk, framed in wood. On the left, Dylan, arms crossed, grinning with a missing front tooth. On the right, Daniel, a photo Martin had tracked down through Olivia, the man whose death had started it all, the man whose life Martin had once saved without knowing who he was. They shared a shelf, they always would. One autumn afternoon, Dylan sat beside him on the porch swing, legs too short to touch the ground. "Dad," he said, licking chocolate frosting off his thumb, "why don't you marry someone? All the other kids at school have 2 parents." Martin looked out across the rust-colored trees, their leaves turning to fire. "Because," he said, "I already live with the 2 people I love the most. You, and the person you remind me of." Dylan tilted his head. "Like a ghost?" Martin laughed. "Maybe, but a good ghost, the kind that makes sure we stay good, too." Dylan didn't ask more. He leaned into Martin's side and yawned. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of earth and pine. Martin closed his eyes. He had not forgiven Olivia. Not fully, not yet, maybe never, but he had forgiven himself. For not knowing, for not seeing, for staying, and that, he thought, was enough. He didn't raise Daniel's son out of obligation. He raised him as repayment. A promise, a quiet vow to a man long gone. Not for love, but for honor. And in the end, that was what made him a father. People don't talk about the way silence can rot a marriage. James didn't notice it at first. Silence came gradually, like water wearing down stone. It wasn't the loud kind, the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the tearful nights on the couch. No, his marriage to Julia had none of that. Just the quiet kind, the kind that settles like dust in corners you forget to check. One day, he realized he couldn't remember the last time Julia had laughed at one of his jokes. She still smiled, still touched his shoulder when she passed him at the kitchen sink. Still called him, love, when she brought him tea. But her eyes, they no longer tracked his face when he spoke. They looked past him, through him, somewhere else. James tried not to think about Ryan. Ryan, with his easy grin and the sort of charm that aged well. Not fast. Ryan, who had been James's best friend since high school. The kind of guy who showed up to every barbecue and remembered Max's birthday without fail. And who always had a moment alone with Julia. In the garden, on the porch, laughing about some old inside joke James had never been part of. Then there was Helen, Julia's mother, the ever-present third wheel. A woman whose presence could be described as intentional. She adored Julia, she liked James, but there was something guarded in the way she treated him, like she knew a secret he wasn't meant to learn. James told himself he was being paranoid, that marriages go through phases, that in-laws are supposed to be a little weird, that best friends sometimes click better with our partners than we'd like. Still, the small things added up. Julia always got defensive when Ryan's name came up. Even casually, Helen would deflect or change the subject. And Max, their bright-eyed, curious 8-year-old, had recently asked, "Dad, how come I don't look like you at all?" James had laughed it off. Genetics are funny that way. But the question burrowed under his skin like a splinter. Then Helen died. It happened quickly, a stroke. One day she was reminding James to take his allergy meds. The next she was gone. Julia unraveled in a way he hadn't expected. Not just tears, but grief that felt layered. Too deep, too unresolved. James let her grieve. He handled the funeral arrangements. Called relatives. Chose a tasteful photo for the memorial card. He moved like a machine, efficient, numb. A week later, he began cleaning out Helen's attic. Boxes of old linens, dusty photo albums, mismatched candlesticks, and then, in a drawer beneath a stack of expired coupons, a box marked, private. Inside, a journal, leather-bound, aged, no lock, no fanfare, just a soft creak as he opened it. The first entries were mundane, grocery lists. Notes about her garden, then a shift. Ryan stopped by again today. He brought lilies. Julia wore that blue dress I hate. I told her it was too revealing. She laughed and said Ryan didn't mind. I stayed inside, watched them from the window. They stood too close. I'm too old to pretend I don't see. James's breath hitched. He flipped forward. Julia says James suspects. I told her not to worry. He trusts too easily. Like a boy in a maze with a map drawn in crayon. Sweet, but hopeless. Max is growing fast. Ryan's smile. Ryan's eyes. I wonder if James sees it yet. He froze, staring at the ink, at the betrayal curling in cursive letters across the page. His ears rang, a soundless buzz. He sat back, the journal still open, and stared at a nearby photo on the attic wall. A family Christmas. 5 years ago. Julia with her arm around Ryan, laughing at something he'd said. Helen smiling behind them. James, standing to the side, holding Max, who was beaming with a grin that now looked like a stranger's. He closed the journal slowly, placed it back in the box, walked downstairs. Julia was in the kitchen, making tea. She looked up and smiled. "Did you find anything useful?" James paused. "Just dust." He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, while Julia breathed softly beside him. The woman he had loved. The friend he had trusted. The child he had raised. Everything suddenly felt unfamiliar. He turned to face the wall. And somewhere deep in his chest, something began to crack. Not anger. Not yet. Just the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. Everyone remembers the candles, not the cake, or the clown, or even the rented magician who made a rabbit appear from a plastic hat. Just the candles, and the way James held the lighter in his hand for a few seconds too long. Like he was deciding whether to set the cake aflame or something else entirely. Max turned 9 that day. The backyard was filled with colored streamers and half-finished juice boxes. Children darted between folding tables. Faces painted like lions and butterflies. Julia fluttered through it all like the perfect hostess. Directing servers, refilling chips, laughing a little too brightly. And Ryan stood near the grill, flipping hot dogs, blending in like background music. Like he belonged. James had spent weeks planning this. The DNA test kit arrived 3 days earlier. Discreetly packaged. He had registered it under a false name. Hidden it in a locked drawer in his office. He knew the moment he'd use it. The toast. The party stretched on under the golden haze of late afternoon. Max opened gifts with squeals of delight. A new bicycle, a telescope, a set of books about outer space. Then it was time for cake. James carried it out himself. A rich chocolate tower with 9 candles flickering on top. Max grinned, eyes wide with anticipation. James leaned in, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered, "Make a good wish." They sang. Max blew out the candles. Applause followed. And then James tapped his glass with a spoon. A soft ting-ting-ting that cut through the laughter. "I'd like to say something," he began, voice smooth, practiced. The chatter died. Julia turned, still smiling. Ryan looked up from his beer. To Max, James said, "The brightest kid I know. The one who asks the hardest questions. The one who makes me better. Just by existing." Max beamed, cheeks red. "But also," James continued, "to family, not the one we inherit. Or even the one we marry into. But the one we choose. The one we build. The one we see clearly, eventually." There was a beat of silence. James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. He walked to the table where Julia and Ryan sat, and placed the envelope between them. Not with force, not with drama, just gently, like he was setting down a check after dinner. Julia's smile flickered. Ryan's fingers tightened around his glass. James didn't elaborate. He just nodded once, turned back to the crowd, and said, "Let's cut the cake." The rest of the party moved like molasses. Children ran, but slower. Conversations continued, but softer. Julia disappeared into the house. Ryan left 15 minutes later without saying goodbye. That night, James sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the unopened envelope he had retrieved after everyone left. He didn't need to open it to know what it would confirm. But he did. 2 weeks later, the results arrived. A printed page. Simple, clinical. Probability of paternity, 0%. Julia found him on the porch, holding the page like a verdict. She didn't speak at first. Just knelt in front of him, hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted it to be like this." James looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. And yet, he felt nothing. No rage, no sorrow, just a quiet confirmation of something he'd already known in his bones. "Was it just once?" he asked. She nodded. "It was stupid. I was confused. Ryan. He was just there. It meant nothing." James tilted his head. "Then why did your mother lie for you?" "For years." Julia's face crumpled. She buried it in her hands. "Because she thought she was protecting me. Protecting all of us." James stood. "I don't think she protected anyone," he said, "least of all Max." He walked back into the house, leaving Julia kneeling on the porch like someone left behind in a war she never understood. That night, Max climbed into his lap, holding a drawing of them both, father and son, with capes and crowns. "You're still my hero, right?" the boy asked. James wrapped his arms around him. "Always," he whispered. Ryan left town the next morning. Julia stayed, but James had already begun to disappear from the inside out. The real story wasn't over. It had only begun. You can scream into someone's face. Or you can say nothing, and sometimes saying nothing echoes louder. James said nothing. Julia cried for days. At first, big dramatic sobs that seemed designed to stir sympathy, to crack the shell of silence forming around him. Then quieter ones, silent tears over breakfast, a hand reaching out to touch his that never landed, a voice breaking on a whisper of his name. James. It was a mistake. I was young, I didn't know what I wanted. She tried everything, blaming youth, blaming grief, blaming Ryan, blaming her mother. She manipulated me, she always did. She said if I told you, you'd leave. She said I'd ruin everything. James watched her, not with anger, not even with sadness, just a stillness so profound it frightened her. Say something, she begged one night, her voice ragged. He didn't. She stood there for a long time, hands trembling, then she left the room. The next morning, Max knocked on his bedroom door. It was early, still gray with dawn. James opened the door to find his son clutching a drawing. It was of the two of them. Stick figures, one with glasses, the other smaller, both wearing superhero capes. Is it true? Max asked, eyes wide. You're not really my dad? James knelt. Who told you that? I heard Mom talking on the phone. She was crying. She said you were going to leave. But you're not, right? James reached out and pulled Max into his arms. No, he said, I'm not leaving you. Max sniffled. Promise? Promise. That afternoon, James packed a single suitcase. He didn't call a lawyer, didn't demand custody, didn't shout or threaten. He booked 2 one-way tickets to a quiet town in the mountains, changed his phone number, and mailed in the paperwork to transfer Max's school records. When Julia came home, the house was silent. His things were gone, Max's things too. The only note was on the fridge. Max needs peace. I do too. We're not running, just restarting. Don't come looking, you won't find us. He didn't block her number, but he never answered. Max asked about her once. On the drive upstate. Is Mom mad at us? No, James said softly. She just needed to be alone for a while. Max looked out the window for a while. I think we'll be okay, he said. James nodded. Yeah, he said, we will. But in his heart, something darker stirred, a whisper, not of revenge. Not exactly. Of correction. He wouldn't just protect Max. He'd shape him, mold him, make sure that boy never made the same mistakes, never trusted the wrong hearts, never let silence become a shield for betrayal. He would raise Max to see through lies, through smiles, through mothers who kiss you goodnight while hiding knives behind their backs. He would raise Max to be stronger than he had been. And Julia would live with the silence James left behind. That would be enough. For now. Some men seek revenge with bullets or blades. James used bedtime stories. In the quiet cabin tucked into the pines of the northern mountains. James raised Max with tenderness and purpose. The house was modest, 2 bedrooms. Wood stove, walls lined with books. James worked remotely, coded late into the night, and spent his days with Max. Fishing, hiking, teaching him how to read maps, track stars, boil water from snow. But every night, when other fathers might have read tales of dragons or noble kings, James chose other stories, stories that didn't live in castles, but in quiet rooms, stories not of knights, but of betrayal. He never lied, he just selected the truth carefully. There was once a boy, he would begin, tucking Max into bed, whose mother made a mistake. A big one. She hurt people she loved. And the boy grew up wondering if she ever really loved him at all. Max, young and impressionable, would listen with wide eyes, soaking in the cadence of his father's voice as much as the meaning. The words became part of his nightly rhythm, as familiar as brushing his teeth. Did the boy forgive her? He asked once, small fingers clutching James's sleeve. James kissed his forehead. He learned not all questions have answers right away. There were no monsters in James's stories. Only people. People who chose poorly. People who ran away. People who, despite their smiles, left bruises that couldn't be seen. When Max asked about Julia, rarely, and always hesitantly, James never said she was gone or bad. He simply paused, thoughtful, and said things like, "She chose a different path," or, "Some people aren't strong enough to stay." He didn't need to say more. Children don't need facts to build legends. They build from tone, from gesture, from the long silences adults think go unnoticed. Subtle things, gentle suggestions, just enough to tilt the image in Max's mind. Years passed. The photo of Julia remained tucked in a sealed envelope, buried in a drawer James never opened. But her shadow lingered in the house. Not through memory, but through silence. Her name was a stone on the tongue, one never lifted. On Helen's death anniversary, James lit a single white candle. Max watched the flicker. "Is that for Grandma?" James nodded. "She tried to protect what shouldn't have been protected." He said, "Sometimes love makes people blind." They stood there for a while, side by side. The candle's flame trembled with the mountain wind sneaking through old wood. Max never asked what that meant. He didn't need to. The emails came sporadically, a new one every few months. Julia wrote long messages, desperate ones, short ones, cryptic, apologetic, nostalgic. Once, a photo of Max she had printed from an old school website with the words, "He's grown so much. I miss him." James saw them all. He never replied. Sometimes he would open them and just stare. Not in anger, not even in hurt, just in study, as if reading the fading voice of someone who used to be real, and now only existed as pixels and old habits. One evening, Max was using the laptop to play a space simulator when a notification flashed in the corner of the screen, "Julia M., new message." He clicked. The message opened. Just a few lines. Simple, pleading. Max stared. "Dad, someone wrote you." James walked over, saw the screen. For a split second, something moved behind his eyes. A twitch, a flicker, something like memory trying to claw its way out. Then it vanished. He closed the window, deleted the email. "Spam," he said simply. Max nodded, trusting. It was the truth. In James's world, Julia's presence, unwanted, corrupted, viral, a memory better erased. He wasn't cruel. He fed Max well, gave him books, music, kindness, but he planted seeds too. Seeds that said, "Be careful who you love. Be careful who you believe. Even the ones who kiss your scraped knees might one day lie to your face." He taught Max to ask questions, to think before trusting, to see patterns, to notice what others missed, not in paranoia, but in survival. Max didn't grow up hating Julia, but he didn't grow up missing her, either. James had won, not with violence or law, but with narrative. And no one ever suspects the bedtime story. Because in the end, it's not the truth that shapes us. It's the version of the story we're told first, and most often. At 14, Max wrote an essay for school titled, "My Hero is My Father." It was only 3 pages long, handwritten in neat cursive, but every word hit like a blade James had forged himself. "My father is my hero because he raised me alone, protected me from lies, and taught me how to tell the truth, by first showing me what truth costs." James read the essay alone, sitting at the kitchen table long after Max had gone to bed. He didn't cry immediately, not until the second reading. And even then, not out of pride. The tears came because he knew. He had sculpted his son's mind, not just to love him, but to fear deception, to despise betrayal, to question warmth. It had worked. All of it. This wasn't justice from a courtroom. This was justice from repetition, from shaping perception, from guiding memory like a hand molding wet clay. 2 weeks after the essay, Julia sent one final letter. The handwriting was shakier than James remembered. No pleas for forgiveness, no dramatic confessions, just a quiet hope. "I know I don't deserve it, but if one day Max wants to see me, tell him, "I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting." James never showed it to Max. He burned the letter in the fireplace that same night, watching the flames twist her words into ash. Not in anger, not in vengeance, but in control, because Julia had lost the right to shape the story. Max didn't ask about his mother anymore. Her absence had become a kind of mythology, a ghost without tragedy. Only absence. In his mind, she was a blur of suggestions and shadowed anecdotes. The kind of figure children build when adults leave them too much silence and too few facts. James didn't correct him. He didn't need to. One night, as they sat on the porch watching a late summer storm roll in, Max asked, "Dad, do you think everyone's capable of betrayal?" James took a long time to answer. "I think everyone's capable of anything," he said, "if the lie feels safer than the truth." Max nodded, then said nothing else. On Helen's anniversary that year, they lit the candle as usual, but James stayed behind after Max went to bed. He stared at the flame until it dwindled into smoke. Then he stood before Helen's photo on the mantel. "I didn't kill you," he whispered, "but I finished what you started." He touched the frame lightly, as if forgiving the glass for what it reflected. Because James didn't just erase a family. He rewrote it, line by line, chapter by chapter, until the old story no longer fit. Until Max believed what James needed him to believe, that his father had rescued him not just from a broken marriage, but from a poisonous legacy. He closed the curtains, blew out the candle, and the story was his again. Ethan loved order. He was a man who believed in structure, patterns, and the quiet rhythm of consistency. At 36, he had built a life most men would envy. A successful career as a financial advisor. A home designed down to the color of grout. And a beautiful wife, Claire, who, despite her mysterious past, made every evening feel like a sanctuary. They had candlelit dinners even on weekdays, shared playlists, and journaled in matching leather-bound notebooks. But the one thing missing, the one variable Ethan couldn't account for, was a child. Claire, 34, was graceful in a way that made Ethan often feel like he was dreaming. Her laughter was soft but deliberate, like someone who knew its effect. Before Ethan, she had once been in love, intensely, disastrously, with a man named Jared. Someone Ethan never met but whose name lingered in Claire's past like cigarette smoke. Jared had vanished years ago under vague whispers of misconduct and a ruined reputation. Claire never spoke of him directly, only once mentioning that her time with him ended in pain and complications. It was Claire who brought up IVF. She waited until a quiet Sunday morning, after coffee and croissants, when the sun fell in soft ribbons across the kitchen tile. She sat beside Ethan, took his hand, and said, "I need to tell you something." Ethan's heart clenched. Those words never prefaced anything good. "I can't have children the normal way," she continued. "Something happened in college. An infection. The doctors told me years ago. But there's a way. IVF. We'd need a donor, someone anonymous." Ethan, stunned but trying to be strong, nodded slowly. He loved her. If this was the path to having a family, he would walk it with her. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't want to make her relive pain. Or perhaps, deep down, he didn't want to find out more than what was offered. Claire took control of the process. Every appointment, every medical file, every decision, she handled it. Ethan signed forms when needed, trusted the clinics she chose, and followed along with the sense of detachment he mistook for peace. When their son was born, Ethan felt overwhelmed by joy. The boy had Claire's soft features, her eyes, her smile, but something itched at him, like a note out of tune. The curve of the nose, the shape of the ears, things Ethan chalked up to donor genetics. Still, Claire was oddly evasive whenever Ethan suggested a follow-up with the pediatrician or a simple curiosity about blood type. The doctors said there's no need to poke him unnecessarily. She would smile, a little too rehearsed. Let's just enjoy him. Ethan wanted to believe, and so he did. It was Natalie, Ethan's younger sister, who noticed, a lab technician with a sharp eye and a sharper memory. She visited one afternoon and spent time with the baby. Later that night, she texted Ethan, "Have you ever done a DNA test just to be sure? He doesn't really look like you." Ethan replied with a chuckle emoji and a casual, "He's perfect the way he is." But Natalie couldn't let it go. Something about the child's bone structure, the skin tone, the way his left eyelid creased when he laughed, it nagged at her like unfinished data. One evening, under the pretense of fixing a toy the baby had broken, she collected a few strands of hair from the child's blanket. She didn't tell Ethan, not yet, because Natalie knew, sometimes, the truth is too heavy to give without preparation. And this truth, it was going to split something wide open. Meanwhile, Ethan lay beside Claire that night, watching her sleep. He listened to the even cadence of her breath, the twitch in her lip that signaled she was dreaming. He wondered what she saw. Was it the future they built, or the past she buried? He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead, whispering words she didn't hear. "I trust you." But trust, he would soon learn, isn't always a seed you plant. Sometimes, it's a trap you step into, softly, willingly, without even knowing the ground is about to give way. Natalie waited 3 days before showing Ethan the report. 3 days of rehearsing how to say the words. 3 days of watching her brother beam every time he changed a diaper, kissed a forehead, or whispered lullabies into small, sleepy ears. When she finally placed the envelope on the table, she didn't speak, she just looked at him, eyes already welling, as if mourning something that hadn't died yet, but would. Ethan opened the envelope casually, expecting a curiosity, a technical anomaly Natalie wanted to clarify. But the numbers weren't just confusing, they were damning. No shared alleles, 0% biological relationship. He stared at the words as if they'd been written in fire. The room, once warm with evening light, dimmed around him. He looked up slowly, his mouth open but soundless. "This can't be right," he finally said. Natalie said nothing. She had triple-checked, used 2 labs. She didn't want it to be right either. Ethan went home that night a hollow man. Claire met him at the door, baby in arms, wearing the same silk robe he had bought her for their 3rd anniversary. Her smile faded when she saw his face. He didn't speak until they were alone in the kitchen. And even then, it was a whisper, "Who is the donor?" Claire, her knuckles went white around the edge of the counter. Her breath hitched, just once. Then she said it, barely audible, "You wouldn't understand." But Ethan wasn't asking for understanding. He was demanding truth. "Jared," she said, finally, as if pulling the word from her own throat. The donor was Jared. Ethan staggered back like she'd struck him. The name, Jared, wasn't just from her past. It was infamous. Ethan remembered the scandals, the lawsuits, the whispered rumors in university forums. Jared, the golden boy turned pariah. Claire had always defended him, said it was a vendetta, a misunderstanding. Ethan thought it was just loyalty to an old wound. He never thought she would. "You said you wanted a child," she said, voice shaking. "I wanted that too. I just wanted something of him to live on." Ethan's rage was cold, slow, terrifying. "You lied to me. You forged medical documents. You signed my name. You built this whole thing on a corpse. You wouldn't have agreed," she snapped. "You would have said no. You would have taken that choice from me." Ethan packed a bag that night and left. The next morning, he spoke with a lawyer. The case built quickly: fraud, medical deception, emotional distress. He had evidence, statements, expert analysis. Claire, however, had something else: preparation. Her lawyer, sharp and strategic, filed countersuits, claimed mutual consent, presented documents with Ethan's signature, perfect forgeries. The media caught wind of the story. Wife uses disgraced ex as donor, husband seeks justice. But the headlines didn't help Ethan. If anything, they turned him into a spectacle. Clients left. Contracts were frozen. He was no longer a man seeking truth, he was a scandal magnet. During the hearings, Claire wept strategically, presented herself as a victim of infertility trauma, framed Ethan as emotionally unstable, controlling. She produced email chains, fabricated, but convincing, where Ethan had supposedly approved the donor. The judge ruled in her favor. There was insufficient evidence to prove intentional fraud. Ethan lost, not just the case, but access, custody, control. Most of the assets were in Claire's name, tied up in trusts she managed. Ethan walked out of court not defeated, but transformed. Justice had failed him, so he began planning something else. Not revenge, correction. Because if the law couldn't acknowledge what was stolen from him, then he'd build his own justice system, paper by paper, clause by clause, until Claire thought she had everything, while he quietly made sure she had nothing. And the child wasn't the enemy, but the child would be the axis. Because sometimes, legacy doesn't come from blood. It comes from who controls the story. Ethan didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't collapse into tears. Instead, he became quieter, more deliberate, every movement measured, every word calculated. There was no catharsis, no dramatic shattering of plates or shouting into empty rooms. What replaced grief wasn't rage, it was design. In that stillness, as the walls of his life collapsed, a new architecture began to rise inside him. He wouldn't fight Claire with noise. He would fight her with silence, precision, paper. He stopped asking questions, stopped confronting her, even when she floated around the house with nervous energy, trying to compensate with affection or apology. Ethan offered nothing more than mild, almost indifferent civility. Claire interpreted his calm as distance. In truth, it was preparation. To the world, Ethan was simply a man navigating heartbreak. At work, he claimed he needed time to restructure, which was only half a lie. He withdrew from public speaking engagements, cancelled client meetings, and began to dedicate every waking hour to studying. Not psychology, not healing, law, inheritance law, guardianship frameworks, probate loopholes. He immersed himself in obscure tax shelters and irrevocable trusts. And when the legal jargon became too dense, he hired someone who spoke it fluently, an old law school dropout turned fixer. A man who had once helped corporations disappear wealth through carefully structured shells. Ethan didn't want revenge. He wanted correction. He wanted to build a mechanism so flawless, so elegant, that Claire would never see it coming. Quietly, Ethan began to shift everything. He sold off minor assets, investment condos, offshore accounts, assets Claire didn't even know existed. He routed funds through staggered accounts and reallocated ownership to a new legal entity, a family trust in the name of the child. Claire's greatest pride, the child she had fought to bring into the world on her terms, became the unwitting keystone in Ethan's grand design. The child would own everything. But Ethan would be the only trustee. He rewrote his will, removed Claire from every clause, reassigned beneficiary roles, ensured that in the event of his death, Claire would be entitled to nothing but a courtesy copy of the documentation. Everything went to "my son," a legal phrase that echoed hollowly in Ethan's mind. But one he clung to, not out of affection, but control. The child wasn't an enemy. The child was a symbol, a lever, to reinforce the illusion of reconciliation. Ethan changed his tone at home. He began cooking again, left affectionate notes, tucked the child into bed with stories and lullabies, watching Claire's guarded relief gradually soften. He whispered promises of starting over, and staged moments of intimacy just believable enough to lull her. Claire mistook his compliance for healing. She thought the nightmare was receding. In truth, she was drifting deeper into the trap. And when the time came, Ethan executed the final act. They signed the last round of documents together over dinner, papers she hadn't read thoroughly. Convinced by the warmth of his voice and the light in his eyes. She didn't notice that her name was absent from the ownership declarations. That the custody clauses didn't include shared rights. That the financial pathways no longer led to her accounts. That night, Ethan packed one bag. No dramatic goodbye, no confrontation, just a letter, neatly folded, placed on her vanity. You wanted him, you said he was a gift. Well, now he's yours, entirely. Raise him, love him, explain him, But don't ask why he bears my name. That's your price to pay. He took a red-eye flight out of the country. The next morning, the house was locked, the accounts unreachable, the trust, now airtight and inaccessible to Claire, stood between her and everything she thought she had secured. She woke up to a nursery filled with toys and silence. No crying, no bottle warming, just the creak of a rocking chair and the rustle of legal papers she could never undo. Her emails bounced, her calls never returned. The lawyers shrugged. There is nothing left in your name, they said. Ethan hadn't destroyed her life with fury. He had edited her out of his narrative, left her as a footnote. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it signs quietly in ink. And Claire had everything she ever claimed to want. Except control. And in Ethan's new order. That was the cruelest punishment of all. The morning after Ethan vanished, Claire stood barefoot in the middle of the nursery. The sun, once warm and golden, now filtered through the curtains in a way that felt hostile, too bright, too sharp. The silence was unfamiliar, like the breathless pause after an accident, when the world hasn't caught up to what it just witnessed. The crib was still made. Toys arranged with mathematical precision. A rocking chair slowly creaked from where she'd nudged it unknowingly, but there was no baby in her arms. No Ethan in the kitchen. No illusion left to cradle. At first, she assumed it was a mistake. A power outage, perhaps, affecting their bank logins. A temporary glitch. She called Ethan. No answer. She emailed. Bounced back. She drove to his office. Vacant. She called the firm managing their portfolio. A new voice answered. Due to a change in trustee authorization, we cannot disclose information to you at this time. It wasn't until she went through the kitchen drawer, where Ethan always kept spare keys and old receipts, that she found the second letter. It was shorter than the first. You signed everything. Your thumbprint, not mine. Your name, in ink. There's nothing left for you to challenge. If you need money, ask your donor. Claire screamed, not in a cinematic way. Not a long, operatic wail. It was jagged, guttural, animal, and short, because she knew, almost instantly, that he was right. She hired a lawyer, then another, then 3. They all came back with the same response, airtight. The transfers had been legal, voluntary, notarized, documented. She had been maneuvered, and every step was hers. Everything was still in the name of the child, but without Ethan's signature as trustee. Claire couldn't touch a dollar. Not the house, not the accounts, not the business shares. She had, in essence, built a shrine to her own manipulation, and Ethan had sealed it shut. When Jared showed up 2 months later, Claire was living in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. He looked thinner, more tired, but not regretful, just resigned. I heard what happened, he said. I want to be a father. Claire laughed in his face. Not because it was funny, because it was tragic. You can barely be a person. Jared left without another word. And Claire sat alone on a couch that wasn't hers, staring at a wall she hadn't painted, cradling a child who looked at her with increasing distance. The boy began asking questions. Small ones at first. Why don't we live in the old house? Where is Daddy? Claire offered half-truths, vacant reassurances, until one day, she found him holding a notebook Ethan had left behind. Inside, a message written in blocky, deliberate script. You were conceived through betrayal. But you are not a mistake. I chose to love you. Even if she didn't choose to tell the truth. Claire ripped the notebook from his hands. Screamed. He stared at her, not with fear, but with something worse, disappointment. As if he had glimpsed the beginning of a truth and wanted to understand it, but she had slammed the door shut. Why did you lie to Daddy? He asked. She slapped the counter. Not him, never him, but the noise made him flinch. He ran to his room, locked the door. From that day on, the boy grew colder, not defiant, not cruel, just distant, like he was building a quiet archive of grievances. Claire tried to overcompensate, gifts, outings, praise, but the questions never stopped, and her answers never satisfied. She developed insomnia, then anxiety, then depression. She stopped trusting reflections, felt eyes in the mirror judging her. Ethan's eyes, the child's eyes, her own. In her apartment, there was only one framed photo. The baby, moments after birth, still red, still wrinkled, unaware, pure. Claire stared at that photo every night before bed. Not because it brought comfort, but because it reminded her there had once been something real, something unbroken. But even that, she feared, had been a lie. And now, the name the child carried, Davis, wasn't just Ethan's legacy. It was a monument, a mark of what Claire had lost. Not just a husband, not just wealth, but the narrative, the control. And slowly, she began to understand. She had given birth to the son of a man she used, and raised him to become the mirror she could never look into. Claire aged in quiet obscurity. The world moved on without her. Swiftly and without ceremony, her reflection changed year by year. More lines. More weight in the eyes. Less certainty in the mouth. But the apartment stayed the same. Small, dim, rented, a place where memories echoed louder than voices. And in that silence, she raised the only thing she had left, her son. The boy with the name she could never quite erase, Davis. He grew tall, intelligent, achieving. At school, he excelled, in sports, in writing, in speech. Teachers called him mature beyond his years. Friends noted his sharp mind, his reluctance to trust. Claire saw it all and said nothing. Because deep down, she knew where that came from. He never asked much about Ethan. But when he did, it was sharp, surgical. Why did he leave? Did you cheat? Did you lie? Questions that pierced through her defenses no matter how carefully she'd built them. Claire lied, then adjusted the lies, then stopped answering. One evening, when he was 16, he came home holding a printout. A scholarship announcement, a full ride to a European academy, funded by an anonymous donor. The name on the foundation wasn't Ethan's. But Claire knew. At the bottom of the letter was a note, for the boy who carries the name. Not the blood. He handed it to her, watched her reaction, said nothing. Weeks later, he asked the question she feared most. What is my real name? Why isn't Dad listed on my birth certificate? Who is Jared? Claire froze. In the silence that followed, she felt the weight of every decision collapse in on itself. She began to answer, then stopped, then began again. Eventually, all she said was, "It's complicated." But that wasn't enough. He had already found Ethan's journal, had already read the note, had already drawn conclusions, and the damage wasn't that he knew. The damage was that he no longer cared to ask. He moved out a year later, went abroad, studied law, then philosophy, wrote essays about moral frameworks and fractured truths, gave talks titled, "Inheritance Beyond Blood." Claire watched from afar, watched his name grow, watched the Davis surname become synonymous with resilience, intellect, and legacy, not hers, his. At one ceremony, she saw him on screen, smiling, holding a medal. Around him, colleagues, journalists, sponsors. One banner read, "Son of Davis." No mention of Claire. She returned home and wrote a letter she never intended to send. A confession, a surrender. In shaky handwriting, she began, "I thought I won. I thought getting what I wanted, your name, your child, your legacy, meant I had beaten you. But I didn't win, I just bought a name. And names don't hold hearts." She folded the letter and placed it beneath her pillow. A nightly ritual, a kind of penance. The boy found it one winter evening when he returned briefly. He didn't cry, didn't rage. He just folded the letter and said, "Thanks for telling me." Claire died 2 years later in a hospice. No obituary, no funeral guests but one. Her headstone read, "Claire, 1988 to 2034. Beneath it, the engraver left a space. "Mother of." It was never filled in. Thomas sat in the courtroom like a man slowly sinking into wet cement. The chair beneath him was upholstered in something too soft for how cold it all felt. And yet the discomfort didn't come from the fabric. It came from the words, from the looks, from the fact that the woman sitting across from him, his wife of 7 years, The mother of his only child was looking at him as if he were a stranger who had hurt her. Elaine wore a dark gray suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair was tied back, makeup precise, tone controlled. She addressed the judge with just the right balance of pain and professionalism. And beside her sat Richard. Richard, of all people. Old college buddy, best man at their wedding. The guy Thomas once trusted enough to confess his worst fears to over whiskey and late-night cigars. Now sitting on the opposite bench, sharpening the knife with his legal credentials. "Your Honor," Elaine said, her voice calm but lined with tremor. "My client has tried for months to co-parent with Mr. Davis. Unfortunately, the emotional unavailability, the dismissiveness, and the outright neglect have left our child confused, frightened, and craving stability." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rise to deny. He'd been advised not to. But in that moment, 1,000 responses screamed behind his teeth. Because it wasn't true, not the way she told it. He loved Henry, had always loved Henry, but he had also been busy. Distant, maybe, working 16-hour days to rebuild after Elaine took half of everything and moved into a condo uptown. The judge scribbled something, then looked up. "Mr. Davis, how do you respond to the allegations that you have been emotionally absent from your son's life?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. Every word felt like it might be the wrong one. "I want to be a father to my son," he said finally, quietly, "but I also want fairness. I wasn't absent, I was surviving." Outside the courtroom, headlines were already forming. Father fights to avoid parental duties. The local news latched onto the case because of Elaine's prominence. She had won several high-profile cases in the city, and now she was seen as the sympathetic heroine defending her child against a cold, calculating financier. What hurt most wasn't the judgment of strangers. It was how fast his friends vanished. No calls, no texts. Even his own sister had said, "Maybe it's time you look at yourself." Thomas. Henry was 5. Too young to know what custody meant. Too small to understand that every time he asked, "When will I see Daddy?" the answer depended on paperwork and perception. After losing the first hearing, Thomas tried to hire another lawyer. But every good attorney seemed to know Richard. Or Elaine. Or both. The ones who agreed to meet offered half-hearted strategies and outrageous retainers. Then came the day he bumped into Meredith. She lived 2 floors below Elaine's new apartment. An old woman with brittle posture and sharper instincts. "That one," she muttered as he held the elevator door for her. "Pretty on the outside, rotten in the middle." He blinked. "Sorry, the lawyer lady. You think I don't see things from my balcony? Richard's car has been there overnight more than once." Before the divorce finalized, she shuffled away without waiting for a response. The seed of doubt that Thomas had buried deep began to grow. Elaine had always been careful, but now the lines were too clean, too convenient. The way Richard argued with just enough intimate knowledge to press Thomas's buttons. The way Elaine cried in court but smiled in parking garages. The timelines were suspicious. The accusations, too perfectly constructed. Thomas stopped looking for another lawyer. He started looking for answers. Because something was off. Not just heartbreak. Not just a bitter ex using the courts. No, this felt orchestrated, like a play. And maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been cast as the villain by accident. Maybe the script had been written long before the first gavel ever dropped. Thomas sat in the courtroom like a man slowly sinking into wet cement. The chair beneath him was upholstered in something too soft for how cold it all felt. And yet the discomfort didn't come from the fabric. It came from the words. From the looks. From the fact that the woman sitting across from him, his wife of 7 years, the mother of his only child, was looking at him as if he were a stranger who had hurt her. Elaine wore a dark gray suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair was tied back. Makeup precise. Tone controlled. She addressed the judge with just the right balance of pain and professionalism. And beside her sat Richard. Richard, of all people. Old college buddy. Best man at their wedding. The guy Thomas once trusted enough to confess his worst fears to over whiskey and late-night cigars. Now sitting on the opposite bench, sharpening the knife with his legal credentials. "Your Honor," Elaine said, her voice calm but lined with tremor, "my client has tried for months to co-parent with Mr. Davis. Unfortunately, the emotional unavailability, the dismissiveness, and the outright neglect have left our child confused, frightened, and craving stability." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rise to deny. He'd been advised not to. But in that moment, 1,000 responses screamed behind his teeth. Because it wasn't true, not the way she told it. He loved Henry, had always loved Henry, but he had also been busy. Distant, maybe, working 16-hour days to rebuild after Elaine took half of everything and moved into a condo uptown. The judge scribbled something, then looked up. "Mr. Davis, how do you respond to the allegations that you have been emotionally absent from your son's life?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. Every word felt like it might be the wrong one. "I want to be a father to my son," he said finally, quietly, "but I also want fairness. I wasn't absent, I was surviving." Outside the courtroom, headlines were already forming. Father fights to avoid parental duties. The local news latched onto the case because of Elaine's prominence. She had won several high-profile cases in the city, and now she was seen as the sympathetic heroine defending her child against a cold, calculating financier. What hurt most wasn't the judgment of strangers. It was how fast his friends vanished. No calls, no texts. Even his own sister had said, "Maybe it's time you look at yourself." Thomas. Henry was 5. Too young to know what custody meant. Too small to understand that every time he asked, "When will I see Daddy?" the answer depended on paperwork and perception. After losing the first hearing, Thomas tried to hire another lawyer. But every good attorney seemed to know Richard. Or Elaine. Or both. The ones who agreed to meet offered half-hearted strategies and outrageous retainers. Then came the day he bumped into Meredith. She lived 2 floors below Elaine's new apartment. An old woman with brittle posture and sharper instincts. "That one," she muttered as he held the elevator door for her. "Pretty on the outside, rotten in the middle." He blinked. "Sorry, the lawyer lady, you think I don't see things from my balcony? Richard's car has been there overnight more than once." Before the divorce finalized, she shuffled away without waiting for a response. The seed of doubt that Thomas had buried deep began to grow. Elaine had always been careful, but now the lines were too clean, too convenient. The way Richard argued with just enough intimate knowledge to press Thomas's buttons. The way Elaine cried in court but smiled in parking garages. The timelines were suspicious. The accusations, too perfectly constructed. Thomas stopped looking for another lawyer. He started looking for answers. Because something was off. Not just heartbreak. Not just a bitter ex using the courts. No, this felt orchestrated, like a play. And maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been cast as the villain by accident. Maybe the script had been written long before the first gavel ever dropped. Thomas watched the cursor blink on his screen, the laptop humming softly on the old oak desk. For hours, he'd sat there, combing through the contents of Elaine's forgotten MacBook, a relic she'd used before switching to her newer, encrypted machine. He'd found it in a moving box labeled "Books and Winter Stuff" in the garage. Untouched since the separation, what began as a desperate act of curiosity had become an obsession. And now, he was past the point of no return. The data recovery specialist he hired, quiet man, cash payment, no receipts, had pulled entire folders from the depths of the hard drive. Deleted emails, archived messages, old attachments. What emerged wasn't just a paper trail, it was a confession. One by one, Thomas opened the documents, a PDF of a forged psychological report labeling him emotionally abusive and mentally unstable. A spreadsheet mapping the timeline of Richard's offshore transfers, funds rerouted through 3 shell companies before landing in an account in the Cayman Islands. Dozens of emails, flirtatious and cruel, between Elaine and Richard. "We'll drain him," Elaine had written. "He's too logical to see it coming. He'll fight fair. And that's our advantage." Thomas's hands trembled, not from rage. He was far past that. What filled him now was something colder, something cleaner. It wasn't just betrayal, it was architecture. Every kindness Elaine had shown him in the months before the divorce now read like choreography. Every insult Richard had slipped in during the hearings felt like a rehearsed line. But worst of all were the photos. Screenshots from the nanny cam in Henry's old room, ones he'd installed himself years ago. In them, Richard was playing with Henry like a second father, holding him, teaching him to tie shoelaces, whispering things into his ear. It wasn't grooming, it was worse, it was rewriting. Thomas compiled everything into a secure drive and walked it straight into the regional office of the IRS. He didn't give his name. Didn't need to. The files were thorough, labeled, time-stamped, and the crimes were unmistakable: money laundering, tax evasion, fraudulent filings. A week later, a woman from the IRS reached out, not by email, not by phone, but in person. She met Thomas at a diner at 10 p.m., slid into the booth without a word, and ordered tea. Only then did she slide a card across the table. "Special Investigations Unit. We've been watching Richard," she said. "But this ties the whole picture together. You just made yourself very useful." Thomas said nothing, just nodded, because justice didn't need a speech. It needed a push. In the weeks that followed, Elaine grew more brazen. She transferred another large sum into a newly created education fund for Henry, one Richard had encouraged. What she didn't know was that her every transaction was now being monitored. Every email flagged, every call traced. Then, on an otherwise uneventful Tuesday morning, the doors to Richard's office were kicked open. FBI agents poured in. Computers seized. Files bagged. Richard didn't resist. He just blinked slowly as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Like he'd known this was always a possibility, and still thought he was untouchable. Elaine's summons came days later. She was named as an accessory to conspiracy and tax fraud. Her law firm distanced themselves instantly. Her name scrubbed from the masthead. Clients withdrew. The media turned. The woman once praised as a champion of family law was now labeled a fraudster. Through it all, Thomas remained quiet. He didn't gloat, didn't comment. He spent his days with Henry, packing lunches and reading bedtime stories. But every night, he returned to that old laptop, not to investigate, but to remind himself how close he came to losing everything, and how sometimes, justice wears a plain face, and moves silently, until it doesn't. Henry stood on the porch of a modest blue house, suitcase in one hand, social worker in the other. He was too young to understand everything, but old enough to feel the fracture. His eyes darted around the neighborhood as if searching for something familiar, something to anchor him. When Thomas opened the door, his expression was careful, not joyful, not heartbroken, just calm, like a sea that had seen too many storms. The placement was temporary. That was the official language. The state, in light of recent legal developments, had removed Henry from Elaine's custody and placed him with a government-approved foster arrangement. But Thomas had filed a petition to change that, and he had more than a good chance. He had created a trust, an educational fund specifically earmarked for Henry. The money came from assets recovered during the investigation into Richard and Elaine's financial schemes. Thomas hadn't fought for wealth. He fought for meaning, and now, he was offering it all to Henry, under one condition: that he be allowed to call him father again. Henry's first week was quiet. He kept to himself, reading books, drawing pictures, watching the rain tap against the window. Thomas didn't push. He cooked meals. He walked Henry to the school bus. He asked how his day was, even when the only answer was a shrug. One night, Henry left a drawing on the kitchen counter. It was two figures holding hands. Above one, it said, "Me." Above the other, it said, "Dad." Thomas stared at it for 10 minutes, then wept. He never spoke ill of Elaine. When Henry asked where she was, Thomas told him she was doing some hard things and needed time to fix her mistakes. He didn't lie, but he didn't poison. Elaine, meanwhile, was facing a sentence of community service and the loss of all improperly gained assets. She avoided jail only because her lawyers struck a deal, citing her willingness to cooperate with federal investigators. But her reputation was beyond repair. Her firm let her go. Her name was now synonymous with scandal. Richard didn't get off so easy. The offshore accounts, the falsified tax returns, the shell corporations. It added up to 5 years in federal prison. Disbarred, disgraced, and utterly alone, Thomas watched from afar, not with vengeance, with detachment. He didn't want them ruined. He wanted Henry safe. Weeks turned to months. Henry grew comfortable. He smiled more, laughed louder. At school, he started writing his name as Henry Davis. The teachers asked if that was a mistake. He said, no, that was his name. Paperwork followed. Adoption papers finalized. School records updated. Medical files amended. For all intents and purposes, Thomas was, once again, the father of record, legally, emotionally, permanently. One afternoon, a letter arrived in Thomas's mailbox. No return address, just his name in familiar handwriting. It was from Elaine. Inside, a single sentence: I lost everything, not because of the courts, but because you never stopped being his father. Thomas folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not out of malice, but because there was nothing left to say. The past had played its hand, and the future was already here, calling him Dad from the kitchen, asking if they could make pancakes for dinner. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes, it came with crayons, and a name reclaimed. The sea air was sharp with salt and the scent of pine. The town Thomas had chosen was small: 2 stoplights, 1 grocery store, and a view of the ocean that stretched like eternity. He and Henry arrived with just 3 suitcases and a silence forged by what they'd survived. For Henry, it was the silence of confusion, of too many adult words spoken too loudly over his head. For Thomas, it was the silence of rebuilding. Their home was a modest cottage near the dunes, a place where windows caught the sunrise and the porch creaked with memory. Thomas found peace not in what he had regained, but in what he no longer needed to fight for. Here, no one knew about the courtroom betrayals, the national headlines, or the name Elaine. Here, he wasn't the man wrongly accused, he was just a father. And that was enough. He began offering free financial literacy workshops at the community center every Thursday evening. Widowers, single mothers, veterans, people who had been fractured by love, by law, by life, sat in folding chairs and listened. Thomas didn't speak about his past, but everything he taught came from it. Every year, on the anniversary of the adoption, his legal rebirth as Henry's father, Thomas packed a picnic. No friends, no family, just the 2 of them. They'd sit on the beach, sandwiches in hand, watching the tide erase their footprints. In the living room hung 2 frames. One was a photo of Thomas and Henry from that first picnic, both windblown and smiling. The other was a laminated court document, framed in aged wood. Thomas Davis is unfit to parent. He never took it down. It reminded him that truth isn't what's declared, but what's proven, quietly, patiently, with love. As Henry grew, so did his questions, and Thomas never dodged them. He explained betrayal without bitterness, justice without vengeance. He told his son that being right wasn't enough. You had to be kind. That dignity wasn't given, it was chosen. Henry flourished, top of his class, captain of the debate team, the kind of teenager who stayed behind to help clean up. People said he looked like Thomas, though they shared no blood. But every habit, every conviction, every fierce defense of fairness, that was learned. Far away, in a city that didn't remember her name, Elaine worked at a bookstore under an alias. She spoke little, smiled politely, and filed away the years like receipts she could never return. When Henry turned 16, she received a card in the mail. There was no return address, just his handwriting: "Thank you for giving me life. But Dad taught me how to live it." Elaine wept, not for forgiveness, that would have been too easy. She wept because she realized she was now a footnote in a life that no longer needed her narrative. And on the day of Henry's high school graduation, Thomas stood in the crowd as his son stepped up to the podium. Henry adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and said, "My name is Henry Davis. I carry my father's name, not by birth, but by belief, because being someone's child is not about blood. It's about who shows up." Thomas didn't cry, he just smiled, because some men are stripped of everything, and still win, not with revenge, but with the legacy of being someone worth remembering. David had always prided himself on being a man of science and structure. As a high school biology teacher, he believed in the elegance of genetics, the poetry of chromosomes, and the symmetry of Mendelian laws. His life was guided by logic, by truth that could be verified. That was why, when his daughter Emily asked him a simple question one evening over dinner, it never occurred to him that the answer would become the crack in the foundation of everything he knew. They had just finished a light meal. The room was filled with the warmth of golden hour light streaming through the windows. A quiet Thursday in May, and the family was unusually relaxed. Emily, now 17, sat curled in the armchair across from her parents, textbook on her knees. She was preparing for her final biology exam before graduation, and, always the curious student, she had been peppering her father with review questions all week. "Hey Dad," she asked, almost playfully, flipping a page, "what's your blood type again?" David, wiping his glasses, answered without a second thought. "AB, why?" Laura, seated beside him, sipped her tea. "I'm type A," she added. Emily paused. A flicker passed over her face, so brief, so subtle, that neither parent seemed to notice. But inside her head, gears turned. She stared back at the table, doing mental math she had never thought she'd need. She was O, Group O, the recessive blood type, incompatible with a parent who was AB. She smiled, nodded, moved on, but that smile was paper thin, hiding a gathering storm behind her calm demeanor. Something felt wrong, not in the overt way of broken windows or raised voices, but in the quiet dissonance of a puzzle piece that didn't fit. That night, in the shared darkness of a sleepover, Emily whispered her thoughts to Mia, her best friend since 4th grade. Mia's father was a hematologist, and she, like Emily, had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of adventure. "You think it's a mistake?" Mia asked, rolling onto her side. Emily bit her lip. "Maybe, but what if it isn't?" The next day, they began to plan, not out of malice, not with dramatic music playing in the background. Just two girls chasing a question that refused to let go. Mia offered to help collect the samples. Emily, in her quiet determination, waited until her parents were out and gathered strands of hair from their brushes. Hers was easy. She packed them into a small envelope and gave it to Mia, who passed it to her father's colleague under the guise of a school project. The waiting was the hardest part. Days bled into weeks, and Emily found herself looking at her father differently. Every moment of affection felt more fragile. Every "I love you, kiddo" was laced with guilt she didn't yet understand. Then, one Friday after school, Mia handed her the envelope. It was plain, clinical, sealed. Emily opened it alone. The room was silent except for the soft hum of her desk lamp. As she read, her breath caught. The test confirmed it. She was not biologically related to David. Her heart didn't break, it splintered, not because she didn't love her father, she did, fiercely, but because the truth had been hidden, manipulated, kept from her like a secret that someone hoped would never surface. And now that it had, she couldn't unknow it. She didn't confront anyone, not yet. She printed the report, folded it, wrapped it in bright birthday paper with a ribbon, wrote a card that simply read, "To the man who raised me." Her father's birthday was in 3 days. She knew what she was doing, but she didn't yet know what it would cost. The air at David's 49th birthday party was filled with laughter and the scent of vanilla frosting. Friends from school, former colleagues, and a handful of neighbors mingled in the backyard under strings of warm lights. A large cake sat on the table, adorned with the words, "To the best dad," and Emily moved among the guests with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had tucked her gift into a small blue box. Nothing extravagant, just a plain box with a silver ribbon. Inside, wrapped in white tissue paper, was the DNA test. No note, no explanation, just the truth folded neatly and waiting. She waited until most of the presents had been opened before handing hers over. Her eyes never quite meeting her father's. David, flushed from laughter and a glass of wine, accepted it with a grin. "From my favorite girl," he said. He opened it carefully, the way he did with all of Emily's gifts, expecting something sentimental, a drawing, a photo album, maybe even a book. Instead, his hands stilled over the paper, and as his eyes scanned the document, his face began to change. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, just a quiet unraveling. The corners of his smile fell, his eyebrows drew together, and the lines on his face deepened. Not from age, but from something older, betrayal. The conversations around them began to fade, one by one, until only silence remained. Laura, sensing the shift, stepped forward quickly. "Why don't we cut the cake?" she said brightly. Too brightly. David didn't look at her. His eyes were still on the paper. Then, calmly, almost gently, he asked, "Emily, how long have you known?" Emily's voice was soft, but unwavering. "Since last month. I wanted to be sure." She turned her gaze to Laura. "What did you hide from me? Mom, why did you never tell me that Dad isn't?" She swallowed hard. "That Dad isn't my biological father." Laura froze, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then stammered, "Emily, it was complicated. I never meant for you to find out like this." "But it's true?" Emily asked. Laura sat down, her knees suddenly weak. Then she nodded. "Yes, your biological father is someone I knew in college. Alan. He was David's roommate. He left the country years ago. He doesn't even know about you." David didn't speak. He simply folded the paper again, set it on the table, and stood. The silence was louder than any scream. Emily blinked back tears, then walked away from the crowd, disappearing into the house. The party never quite recovered. People murmured excuses, plates were cleared, and eventually the backyard stood empty. Laura tried to follow Emily, but the door to her room was locked. She spent that night crying in the kitchen. David slept in the guest room. In the days that followed, Emily refused to speak to Laura, not out of rage, but out of a deeper, colder distance. David continued making her breakfast, driving her to school, asking about her day, but he never mentioned the test, or the party, or the man named Alan. Laura tried to explain. She wrote a letter to Alan, unsure if it would even reach him, unsure if he would care. Maybe she hoped that if the man who shared Emily's blood knew the truth, something could be salvaged. Perhaps Emily could find closure. But closure wasn't a gift she could wrap. It wasn't something she could buy. It was something she had shattered, one lie at a time. Laura had never imagined that one day, she would be blocked out of someone's life not by rage or hatred, but by cold, methodical rejection. Her attempts to reach Alan became an obsession, not to rekindle old feelings. Not even for closure, but simply to find something to cling to, a thread to stitch back together the unraveling fabric of her life. She tried every possible method. Email accounts from the past, messages on social platforms with vague subject lines, even an old alumni group chat. One day, she finally received a response. Not a voice, not a call, just a text message. 7 words. "I don't have a child. Leave me out." There was no ambiguity in Alan's tone, no pause for interpretation. It was a wall, and behind that wall, the person she once trusted had locked away any responsibility. Or maybe he had never wanted any in the first place. She sat in silence for hours, phone clutched in her hand, as if staring long enough would force him to take the words back. Meanwhile, Emily had begun the process of erasure. She moved in with David's mother, not because the house was comfortable, but because it was the furthest place she could find from Laura that still felt like home. The woman who had once tucked her in, braided her hair, packed her lunch with little notes, that woman had become a stranger in her eyes. Laura, in denial, tried to breach the barrier with gestures, flower deliveries, birthday cards, a bracelet she once promised to gift Emily on her 18th. All of it returned. One day, a package landed on her doorstep. Inside, every memory Laura had tried to preserve. The baby blanket, the first drawing Emily ever made, the old music box. At the top, a single note in Emily's handwriting. I don't know who you are. Laura attended the scholarship ceremony in secret. Dressed in navy, makeup subtle, she hoped to blend in, just to see her daughter walk across the stage. But she never made it past the school gate. The staff, courteous but firm, explained she wasn't on the list. So she stood outside, fingertips gripping the cold metal fence, watching from a distance as Emily accepted her award with poise. Later that week, David filed for divorce. He didn't ask for assets, didn't argue over finances. He requested only one thing: full custody. When asked why, he simply stated, I want my daughter to grow up knowing what truth feels like. Laura's descent was not sudden, but steady. Her work faltered. She stopped showing up. Eventually, she entered therapy. The diagnosis was unsurprising: major depressive disorder with episodes of paranoia. She felt eyes everywhere, judgment in every silence. Shame became her only companion. But Emily was ascending. Her college essay, Truth Does Not Require Permission, was a declaration of everything she had learned not just from books, but from betrayal. She received a full scholarship. Her future was no longer a question. In the dim glow of her apartment, Laura spent most nights alone, a shawl wrapped around her, eyes fixed on a photo album. Her fingers trembled as she turned each page, pausing at the image of a toddler smiling in a sun hat, of a mother holding her tight. One night, unable to contain the heaviness in her chest, she opened her journal and wrote, I may have been the one to give her life, but I destroyed the story that life could have told. It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever write. And no one would ever read it. From the moment Emily stepped through the grand iron gates of the state's most prestigious law school, she carried with her more than just ambition. She bore a fire, one that had been lit not by textbooks or mock trials, but by the quiet devastation of betrayal. Her past didn't just live in the shadows of her mind, it stood at the podium beside her. Every time she read about guardianship law, every time she watched case studies of custody battles and protective services failures. She wasn't here to win arguments. She was here to defend the children who had no one else. She chose the most grueling electives: child advocacy, legal ethics in domestic cases, trauma-informed deposition, outside class hours. She volunteered at the local foster services unit, sorting paperwork, coordinating visits, sometimes just listening. Children didn't trust easily, but they liked Emily. She didn't talk down to them. She didn't pity them. She understood, in ways few adults ever could. By her second year, Emily's name was already circling through faculty meetings, not just for her grades, which were immaculate, but for her clarity under pressure. Her professors recommended her to the county prosecutor's office for a rare internship reserved only for the most exceptional. She was accepted. At just 23, she became the youngest intern the office had ever taken on. Then the case arrived. It was labeled as sensitive, a complaint involving alleged inappropriate behavior by a middle-aged tutor at a private learning center. The details were harrowing. The accused had used their position to manipulate vulnerable students. The case required immediate background checks and verification of employment records. It landed on Emily's desk as a preliminary file, meant only for clerical handling. She opened the report and stopped breathing. The accused's name was Lena Morrison, but the photograph didn't lie. It was Laura, her mother, her biological mother, the woman whose face she had erased from every frame in her mind, now resurfaced in a mugshot attached to allegations of misconduct. Emily didn't say a word to anyone. She quietly followed procedure, checked addresses, confirmed aliases, gathered transcripts. The background search had already caught the discrepancy. Lena Morrison was a false name. Laura had fabricated documents to secure employment. A deeper inquiry had flagged a sealed incident involving a minor complaint years prior, nothing conclusive, but enough to cause concern. The office moved swiftly. The trial date was set within weeks. On the morning of the arraignment, Emily sat in the back of the courtroom, in a seat she'd come to know well. She didn't look at the woman being escorted into the defendant's box. But Laura looked at her, with trembling hands and eyes too old for her face. Laura mouthed something, perhaps, Emily, or, I'm sorry, but it was too late. During the witness confirmation segment, the defense attempted to assert family bias in the investigation, claiming Emily had reviewed the file. The judge called for a clarification. The prosecutor assured the court that Emily had not participated in any formal decisions. Still, the defense insisted on transparency, and so the question was asked by a weary public defender with glasses too large for his face, Ms. Davis, is the accused your biological mother? Emily stood. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice did not falter. No, my mother died the day I graduated. The silence that followed was not one of shock, it was reverence. Even the judge glanced down at his notes, not out of disinterest, but perhaps to give Emily the dignity of unreturned stares. The media pounced, as they always do. Headlines the next day screamed, "Daughter turns back on accused mother in courtroom showdown." But Emily ignored every request for comment. She turned her phone to airplane mode, deleted her press notifications, and walked into her office as though nothing had happened. She opened a new file. It was another custody case. A girl named MIA, age 8, left in the care of a stepfather with no legal guardianship. Emily adjusted her chair, took a breath, and started reading. Justice, she had learned, was not a weapon. It was a compass, and it only pointed forward. Laura's sentence was lenient by legal standards, 18 months of probation, accompanied by mandatory community service and a lifelong prohibition from working in any educational or youth-related field. But leniency does not always spare the soul. In her case, the punishment lived not in the hours spent picking up trash along highways or shelving books at the public library, but in the empty apartment where no one called, and no one came. She moved into a modest one-bedroom unit above a laundromat. The walls were paper-thin. She learned the rhythms of strangers, the baby downstairs who cried every night at 2, the man who played saxophone at sunrise. Her own routines became ghost-like: coffee at 7, microwave dinner at 6, and silence in between. Every year, on Emily's birthday, Laura walked to her daughter's last known address. She left a small envelope taped discreetly to the mailbox. Inside was always the same thing: a card with a pressed flower, and 3 words handwritten in cursive, "I still remember." The envelopes were never opened. They disappeared by morning, but whether into the trash or Emily's hands, Laura never knew. David had remarried. His new wife was a quiet woman, an artist who painted landscapes and never spoke about the past. Emily occasionally visited, bringing wine or her latest case files to discuss with David over lunch. They didn't talk about Laura, not because they hated her, but because some stories end without punctuation. There is nothing more to say. One fall afternoon, years later, Emily knocked on the door of her mother's apartment. Laura opened it, hair tied back, wearing an old sweatshirt. She looked smaller, as if grief had quietly chipped away at her dimensions. Emily didn't step inside. She held out an envelope and said, simply, "I forgive you, but I won't forget." Laura didn't cry right away. She waited until Emily had turned the corner. Then she shut the door and leaned against it, clutching the envelope to her chest as though it held heat. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Years passed. Emily became a formidable name in child advocacy law, often quoted in journals and featured on panels. She spoke with precision, with empathy. When asked during one keynote speech what moment had most shaped her, She paused before answering. The day I realized my name no longer belonged to the woman who gave it to me. Laura's health began to decline. With no next of kin listed, a city social worker arranged her hospice care. She passed away quietly at 58. No obituary ran, no service was held. At the morgue, a note was found in the pocket of her nightgown. In shaky handwriting, it read, "My fault." Her tombstone was modest, paid for by the city. It read, Laura Morrison, 1966 to 2024. Beneath her name, someone had engraved, "Mother of Emily." The ellipsis remained unfinished, like the bond they once had, like the story Laura never got to rewrite. What is the price of ambition when your heart is the currency? And your family the collateral? In a world where success demands more than just talent, how far would you go to rise above the rest? This is the story of a woman who made a single choice, and watched everything unravel. Rachel was 32, a talented marketing strategist working at one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the city. Her resume was clean, her mind sharp, and her social skills honed by years of corporate etiquette. At home, she was a wife to Daniel, a 35-year-old civil engineer known for his calm demeanor and unwavering patience. Together, they raised Lily, their precocious 6-year-old daughter, whose laugh still filled every crevice of their modest but warm suburban home. In public, Rachel and Daniel were the kind of couple others admired, polite, supportive, with a visible tenderness between them. But beneath the facade, subtle fissures had begun to form. Rachel's work environment was not merely challenging, it was gladiatorial. Promotions were like lottery tickets, the odds were cruel unless you played dirty. Or so the whispers claimed. And in that cutthroat culture, lines blurred until even the decent began to redefine what was acceptable. At a weekend corporate retreat held in a high-end resort, someone made a joke, wine-glazed and half-serious. A male colleague leaned over and whispered with a smirk, "If you really want that promotion, sleep with the boss." Everyone laughed. Rachel didn't. She smiled, tight-lipped, eyes slightly distant. Not dismissive, not affirming, just quiet. The boss, Greg Harmon, a silver-haired executive with predatory charm, had been circling her for months. Nothing overt, just enough to be deniable. He complimented her pitch decks with more warmth than necessary. He scheduled one-on-one lunches when emails would have sufficed. He lingered too long during handshakes. Rachel wasn't naive. She saw the dance. She knew the rhythm. She had just never decided whether to follow the beat, until now. Something in her cracked that weekend. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe the loneliness. Maybe the quiet resentment that Daniel got to come home at 6 p.m. while she slogged through office politics until midnight. She didn't plan it, but when Greg invited her for a drink in his suite to talk about her future, Rachel said yes. She entered that hotel room as one woman, and left it as another. The act itself was mechanical, almost surreal. She felt like she was watching herself from above, a shadow playing out someone else's ambition. Greg, slick and transactional, didn't say anything afterward beyond a few lines about big things ahead. Rachel showered in the hotel bathroom before returning home. She stood under the water until her fingers pruned, scrubbing herself until her skin felt raw. The promotion came 2 weeks later. A department lead role, corner office, 5-figure raise. Congratulations flooded her inbox. At home, Daniel popped champagne. Rachel smiled, kissed his cheek, and excused herself to the bathroom, where she stared at her own reflection and didn't recognize the eyes staring back. Her relationship with Daniel began to shift. She became elusive. Late meetings, out-of-town conferences, sudden phone calls she had to take in another room. Daniel, ever the gentle husband, didn't press at first. He trusted her, or wanted to. But Lily noticed first. "Mommy's always tired now," she said one night to her dad, her voice small, confused. Rachel began avoiding his touch. She flinched at tenderness. Her guilt had grown roots, wrapping around her chest, choking her from the inside. Still, she justified it. It was just once. It was for the future. For all of them. And then the video arrived. A colleague, no one knows who, had installed a hidden camera in the hallway near Greg's suite. Perhaps for leverage, perhaps for revenge. The footage wasn't graphic, but it didn't need to be. The time stamp, the gestures, the way Greg pressed his hand to the small of Rachel's back as they entered together, it said enough. The file came to Daniel's phone late one night. Sent from an anonymous number. No message, just the video. He watched it in silence. 3 times, then set the phone down like it had burned him. In the quiet house, with Lily fast asleep and the refrigerator humming in the distance, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the wall. The image of his wife disappearing into another man's room played again and again in his head. Grainy but clear. He didn't wake her. He didn't confront her. Not yet. The betrayal hadn't fully registered. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the realization that she had gambled everything. And the worst part, she hadn't even told him the rules of the game. Outside, the street was silent, but inside their home, a storm had already begun. Daniel watched the footage again in the solitude of his car. The screen's cold glow painting flickers of blue across his face. He sat in the darkened garage. The hum of the engine silenced, as if the entire world had paused to let him grieve in private. The image looped. Rachel, his wife. The mother of his child. The woman who once traced hearts on his palm in the quiet of dawn, smiling softly. Brushing her hair behind one ear. Standing far too close to Greg Harmon. Then the moment he would never unsee. Her stepping into the hotel room beside him. The timestamp was unforgiving. It marked betrayal with surgical precision. It was the same weekend she'd kissed him goodbye and said, Chicago. But what cut deeper than the deception was the effortless grace with which she'd done it. No guilt in her eyes. No hesitation. Just Rachel, performing in a play Daniel never auditioned for. His chest tightened, not with rage, but with the slow implosion of dignity. This wasn't just infidelity, it was annihilation. A dismantling of truth. Daniel didn't scream. He didn't throw the phone across the dashboard or punch the steering wheel. He did what rational men do when emotion becomes unbearable. He suppressed it. He saved the video to a private drive, encrypted it, and titled it, without irony, Truth. Then he drove, not home, not to a bar, but to Martin. Martin, Rachel's father, lived with the rigidity of a man carved from war. A retired colonel. He saw the world in binaries, right and wrong, honor and disgrace. He had never fully trusted Daniel, considered him too soft-spoken, too kind. But as he watched the footage on the small screen, his hardened features didn't flinch. Only the slight quiver of his left jaw muscle betrayed the storm brewing beneath. When the video ended, silence engulfed the room like a shroud. Martin finally stood, crossed his arms behind his back, and stared out the window into the dark. I want the family at the estate this weekend, he said. Everyone, including her. The estate was an echo of legacy, an old colonial house where walls remembered generations. It had seen marriages, funerals, and christenings, but this time, it was summoned for a tribunal. Rachel was told to pack light and come alone. No explanations, no discussion. When she walked through the heavy oak doors, she no longer moved like the sharp, confident woman who once led marketing presentations with poise. She looked like someone who had forgotten her place in the world. In the grand dining hall, under a portrait of her grandfather, Rachel stood trial. The family formed a half-moon around her, each face a mirror of betrayal. Her father, seated like a judge, didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. This wasn't just betrayal, he said, it was desecration. Her phone was confiscated, internet cut, no letters, no appeals. Rachel became a prisoner of legacy, shackled not by bars, but by shame. Her mother sat near the window, crying silently into a handkerchief. Her brother refused to look at her. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Back in the city, Daniel filed for divorce, but he asked for nothing. Not the house, not the car, not the joint accounts. He made one request only, to hold full authority over naming their unborn child. A child who now existed in a moral limbo. Was it his? Could he love it regardless? Did it matter? Martin, his voice steel, endorsed the demand. That child will not carry her disgrace. Not in name, not in blood. Corporate headquarters, upon hearing whispers of the scandal, paused Rachel's promotion indefinitely. Her email access was cut. Her name removed from key project documents. Where once her phone rang daily with meetings and congratulations, now there was only silence. Invitations dried. Allies evaporated. Rachel didn't just lose favor, she ceased to exist in professional memory. In her isolation, Rachel wrote 4 pages of ink-smeared sorrow. A letter to Daniel, a confession, a plea. She folded it with trembling hands and sent it through a cousin. He received it. He never opened it. He placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath tax returns and appliance warranties. Some truths were too heavy to read. The days turned to months, and her name faded from headlines and group chats. She became a ghost, whispered about, pitied by some, despised by others. Rachel the strategist became Rachel the shame. A parable passed between mothers and daughters. A warning at office happy hours. She had gambled with what she thought was hers to wager, her body, her choices. But ambition demanded a price no one warned her about. And the cost was everything. What remains of a mother when the world strips her name, her child, and even her mistakes from history? Rachel had once been a central figure in the architecture of her own life, designing her days with purpose and precision. But now, she existed only as a whisper in her family's lineage, a ghost walking the borders of memory. Meanwhile, Daniel had moved forward, or at least, he'd tried. He married Hannah, his childhood friend who had never once demanded more than his presence. She was gentle where Rachel had been driven, quiet where Rachel had been dazzling. Their new home was modest but warm, filled with the gentle laughter of Lily, now 7, and the soft coos of an infant son. Daniel worked long days and returned home to candlelit dinners and soft jazz. Not tension. For a time, it felt like he'd been granted a second life, one he hadn't known he deserved. Rachel, in contrast, remained exiled in the countryside. The home her parents kept was old and sparse, its walls thick with the silence of generational regret. Without internet, without access to the life she'd once ruled, she spent her days cleaning, tending to a small garden, and writing in a journal she hid beneath the floorboards. She wrote not to anyone in particular, but to time itself. Pages filled with ink and pain, apologies to Lily, confessions to the child she never got to name, and words for Daniel that she imagined whispering into the wind. But peace is fragile, and fate, it seemed, was not finished exacting its toll. It was a Thursday when Lily disappeared. She had left for school at 7:15 a.m., as she always did. Hannah packed her lunch. Daniel kissed her forehead. She skipped down the driveway, backpack bouncing. She never made it to class. The school called at 8:42 a.m., asking if Lily was homesick. By 9 a.m., Daniel was at the police station. By 11 a.m., helicopters circled the area. There were no tire marks, no witnesses. The security cameras at the school had malfunctioned that morning, a glitch. They said. Panic was too weak a word for what Hannah felt. She clawed at her own arms, sobbing in hallways. Daniel stopped speaking entirely, operating like a machine on auto drive. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat, he sat by the phone and stared. Then, 3 days later, at 2:14 a.m., a message arrived. It came to Daniel's encrypted cloud drive, the same one where he'd once stored the truth about Rachel. An anonymous link, one file, no name. He opened it. The video was short, 47 seconds. Lily sat on a metal chair in what looked like a storage unit, dimly lit. Concrete walls, no windows. Her arms were folded, eyes wide but dry. No panic, just silence. Then a voice, distorted, as if dragged across shards of glass. Feminine, but corrupted by rage. You took my child. A pause. Static. Now I take yours. Daniel fell to his knees. He knew that voice. It had sung to Lily on rainy nights, had whispered dreams into his ear, had once asked him to name a daughter. It was Rachel's voice, but not as he remembered it. This voice was hollowed out by time and torment. This was a Rachel who had sat too long in silence, who had counted years by absence and regret. A Rachel who had loved too late, too wrongly. The police were called. The video was analyzed, traced, but it had been routed through so many VPNs, mirrored through so many shadows. It might as well have come from another world. Daniel stood by the crib of his son, watching the child breathe, trying to convince himself this nightmare would end. But somewhere, out there, a woman undone was rewriting the narrative. She had lost everything, and in her mind, this was justice. Rachel had re-emerged, not as a mother, not as a wife, not even as a woman. She was vengeance with a heartbeat. And Lily was her final bet. What is a mother when stripped of her child? Her name, her future, a question Rachel never stopped asking herself in the dim hollows of the cottage where time had gone to rot. But if she couldn't be remembered as a mother by others, she would become one in her own terms. And in her mind, that meant reclaiming what had been taken, by law, by shame, by Daniel. She didn't want vengeance, she told herself. She wanted balance, and Lily was the scale. Rachel didn't hire a killer. She hired a driver, a silent man with no questions, no conscience, just a van and an address. Her instructions were simple. Collect the girl after school, drive her to the cabin, keep her safe. She paid in cash, used a burner phone, erased every trace. The world would call it a kidnapping, but Rachel called it retrieval, rescue, redemption. The cabin was hidden deep in a thicket of long-forgotten woods, surrounded by trees tall enough to block signals and memories alike. Inside, she had plastered the walls with photographs of Lily, her first steps, a Halloween costume, a finger-painted drawing with crooked hearts. She arranged them like altars, like proof. Lily belonged to her, not Daniel, not that woman he married. Her. Lily, at first, didn't cry. Rachel gave her hot cocoa and fuzzy blankets. She read stories at night. Stories she had once whispered to Lily through a cracked bedroom door. But the little girl was not the same toddler Rachel had left behind. She was curious, sharp, alert. "Who are you really?" Lily asked one night, her voice barely more than a breath. Rachel smiled with a sadness that hollowed her cheeks. "I'm the one who should have raised you." Back in the city, Daniel had unraveled. The police had leads, but no conclusions. Cameras had nothing. Witnesses had seen nothing. But Daniel had lived with Rachel, loved her once, and that instinct, the one buried beneath betrayal and grief, whispered one name. He hired a private investigator. The man was ex-FBI, fluent in patterns, in anomalies. They traced the video's metadata, found a radio frequency embedded in the static, a brief flicker of sound that shouldn't have been there. Morse code. It said, "Dad, here, cold." It was Lily. Somehow, she had found a way to hijack the cabin's old emergency radio, tap into a forgotten frequency, and send a pulse of hope. It was enough. By the time the task force surrounded the cabin, the moon had vanished behind clouds, and every breath carried the weight of gunpowder and hesitation. Rachel had barricaded the doors, wrapped herself and Lily in a tangle of blankets soaked with kerosene. One flick, one spark, and everything would be ash. She screamed at the windows. No one would take Lily again. She promised she wouldn't hurt her, only herself, and anyone who tried to interfere. Negotiators whispered. Marksmen steadied their aim. But Daniel stepped forward. No weapons, no armor, only words. He asked to speak with her. They let him. He stood 10 feet from the cabin, a flashlight illuminating his face. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He called her not by name, not by pet names once exchanged in love. He called her, the woman inside. "You are not Rachel anymore," he said. "You are not the person I married, or the person I hated. You are a stranger to all of us, even to Lily. And strangers don't raise our children." There was a silence, the kind that swells, then breaks. Inside, Rachel looked at Lily. The child stared back with the kind of gaze that splits hearts. Not fear, not love, something else, recognition, perhaps, of a wound shared, or a story they no longer believed. Rachel loosened her grip. She let the match fall to the ground. It didn't ignite, just rolled, like a question unanswered. When she stepped out, Lily was in her arms. Her voice didn't crack, her eyes didn't plead, she simply said, "At least she still remembers my face." It wasn't a surrender. It was a funeral for a version of herself that never got to live. What happens to a name when it no longer fits the shape of a life? When the title of "Mother" becomes something spoken only in court transcripts and psychiatric evaluations. Rachel Davis was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on charges of kidnapping, identity fraud, and psychological endangerment of a minor. She stood silently as the judge read her sentence. Eyes blank, mouth unmoved, but it was not the gavel or the guards that broke her. It was the sound of Lily's voice, testifying from behind a glass panel, calling her, "the woman who used to sing to me." Lily survived, physically, but survival, as the world knows, is never neat. She endured therapy, endless hours in quiet rooms with careful words and soft chairs. She drew pictures of cabins and fire. She asked questions no therapist could answer. The worst of them all, why did my mom become someone else? Daniel raised her with grace. He never changed Lily's last name, but he filed every official document with the "mother's name" section left blank. Not as punishment, as acknowledgement. There were things he couldn't teach her, wounds he couldn't reach, but he could give her the space to choose what to remember, and what to leave behind. Rachel, behind bars, began writing, not for a publisher, not for the world, for Lily, a memoir of every broken piece, every decision, every lie she told herself to survive the fallout of ambition and shame. She wrote it on smuggled paper, folded each page into her mattress. She never sent them. She knew Lily would not read them, but perhaps one day, they would outlive her. Hannah adopted Lily legally when she turned 10. It was quiet, uneventful, no party, no ceremony, just a notary, a file folder, and a gentle signature. But Hannah left a drawer untouched in the guest room, labeled only with Lily's name. Inside were photos of Rachel, newspaper clippings, the unopened letters. One day, if Lily wished, she could see the woman who once carried her into this world, and carried herself into ruin. Rachel died at 52. Ovarian cancer. The prison warden signed the death certificate. No next of kin claimed the body. A nurse, the one who used to hand her water during chemotherapy, placed a handwritten note in her file. She remembered a song about stars. Sang it every Tuesday. The prison chapel held a 10-minute service. No one came. A chaplain read a psalm. The wind did the rest. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Daniel's home, an invitation to a memorial for Rachel Davis. Lily opened it, read it, and tore it in half. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she dropped the pieces into the trash and went back to her books. Years passed. At 28, Lily stood before a mirror in her wedding gown, veil cascading like silence down her shoulders. She adjusted a loose strand of hair, took a breath, and looked into the lens of the photographer's camera. "I'm not my mother," she said, softly, "but I learned something from her. You can forgive someone by choosing not to carry them anymore." The flash went off. Somewhere, in a drawer marked by time, Rachel's name faded to nothing, and Lily stepped into a new story, unburdened. Not every name is meant to last. But every daughter deserves a future where it doesn't have to. What if the person who just moved in next door knows your wife better than you ever could? Marcus had always believed in clean slates. At 38, with a steady job as a bank manager, a modest home, and a wife he had known for 12 years, life finally felt stable again. Their 6-year-old son, Leo, was the light of his life. After battling through a rough patch of layoffs and emotional exhaustion, moving to a peaceful suburban neighborhood felt like hitting a reset button. The air was quieter here, the trees older, The sidewalks less cracked. Even the birdsong sounded sincere. Alice, his wife, had chosen the house. She said she loved the bay window in the kitchen and the way the morning light fell across the dining table. Marcus agreed, mostly because he wanted her to smile more. Lately, that smile had been rare. He chalked it up to stress. New mortgage, new school for Leo, new routines. But when the neighbor next door knocked on the day they moved in, everything began to shift. Ethan was tall, lean, confident, the kind of man whose handshake lingered. He brought over a bottle of wine and offered to help with the boxes. "Anything for new neighbors," he said, flashing a smile that felt just a little too practiced. Alice's face changed the moment she saw him. Not dramatically, but enough. Her smile tightened, her posture stiffened. Marcus noticed. He always noticed the little things. That evening, Ethan invited him over for dinner. His house was tidy in the way a hotel room is, impersonal yet intentional. He cooked, talked a lot, knew about local schools, traffic shortcuts, even where to find the best bagels. But what struck Marcus most was how Ethan looked at Alice. Not with curiosity, but familiarity, the way you'd look at a book you'd read a dozen times and still loved. Alice barely spoke. When she did, her voice carried a softness Marcus hadn't heard in years. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a presence in their lives. He dropped by unannounced, always with some excuse, fixing a pipe, lending a tool, sharing leftovers. He took a liking to Leo, offering to teach him how to kick a soccer ball properly. At first, Marcus was grateful. It felt good to have help. But soon, help turned into intrusion. One afternoon, Marcus came home early from work. The house was quiet. He found Alice and Ethan in the kitchen, standing too close, whispering. Her hand was brushing a crumb off his shirt. They both jolted when Marcus entered. Alice offered a flimsy explanation about garbage collection schedules. Ethan left in a hurry. Marcus didn't confront her, not then. He wasn't ready for the answer he feared might come. Leo adored Ethan. That stung the most. One night, Leo laughed and called Ethan cooler than Dad. It was innocent, childlike, but to Marcus, it felt like a chisel against the foundation of his family. He smiled in response, but inside, a small crack widened. Then came the neighborhood barbecue, a casual event full of burgers, lawn chairs, and cold drinks. It should have been forgettable, but when one of the older neighbors, slightly tipsy and too talkative, turned to Marcus and said, "Isn't it wild that Ethan and your wife used to date back in college?" They were inseparable. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just looked at Alice, who was frozen, holding a paper plate, her eyes locked on his. She smiled, thin and rehearsed. "That was a long time ago," she said, voice barely above a whisper. And then she turned away. That night, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling. The darkness felt heavier than usual. The air, more stale. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't accuse. He simply stared into the pitch black and wondered how long he had been living next to a ghost from her past. Something wasn't right. It was in the silence. In the long pauses. In the way she avoided his gaze whenever Ethan's name came up. He couldn't name the feeling yet, but it had begun to take shape, an ache beneath the skin, a weight in the chest, something that smelled like betrayal but wore the face of a smile. And deep down, Marcus feared that the worst part wasn't that Ethan was more than just a neighbor. It was the terrifying thought that maybe he had never stopped being something to Alice. Marcus had always believed that love was proven not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acts of showing up. Every school recital, every scraped knee, every bedtime story read with half-closed eyes. Leo, his 6-year-old boy, had inherited Marcus's careful nature, his love for puzzles, and so Marcus believed, his blood. It wasn't something he ever questioned, until the questions began asking themselves. It started with something innocent, routine. Even, Leo had been having recurring rashes, and their pediatrician recommended a genetic allergy test. Nothing urgent, but the doctor, in passing, asked Marcus if he or Alice had any history of a particular autoimmune condition. Marcus said no, confidently, then paused. Wait, he asked, eyebrows furrowed. What gene triggers this again? Later that night, Marcus lay awake, staring at Leo's sleeping face. There was a coolness to Leo's gray eyes that didn't feel familiar. A curve to his ears. An odd tilt to his gait. He tried to shake it off. Kids are a mix of ancestors. After all, but the thought grew roots. Was it irrational? Was it paranoia? Or was it something deeper? Some unspoken intuition clawing for air. He didn't tell Alice. He didn't want to sound insecure. But the seed had been planted. And it was growing wild in the dark corners of his mind. So he did what any man in his position might do when he needed facts to banish fear. He ordered a paternity test. Just a simple, private test, something he could tuck away and forget if it came back with the expected result. The envelope arrived in a plain package. No dramatic music, no thunder, just the mundane thud of paper against wood as he opened it on the kitchen table. He read the results once. Then again. The words didn't change. Probability of paternity, 0%. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. His fingers went numb. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that single, damning line. Leo wasn't his. Biologically, scientifically, not his. He didn't confront Alice. Not immediately. He couldn't. How could he look her in the eyes and ask the question he wasn't ready to hear answered? Instead, he printed the report and placed it in the back of his desk drawer. Behind bank statements and warranty receipts. Somewhere secret, somewhere sacred. He began watching, not stalking, just observing, her texts, her absences, the way her smile seemed forced when Ethan was around, the way she laughed a little too easily at his jokes. One night, after Leo had gone to bed, he finally asked. His voice was steady, but inside he was crumbling. Alice, he said, I need to know, is Ethan Leo's father? She didn't answer, not right away. She looked at him, then at the floor, as if the truth lived somewhere in the shadows. And then the dam broke. She didn't try to excuse it. She didn't lie, she just cried, not the theatrical sobs of guilt, but the quiet, strangled sounds of someone breaking open. It was one night, she whispered, 7 years ago, you and I were falling apart. I ran into Ethan. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to mean anything. I never told him about Leo. I didn't even know for sure at first. And then, I chose you. I chose us. Marcus felt cold, like all the warmth of his life had just been turned inside out. You chose me to be the father of another man's child, he said, not a question, a statement, a sentence. She nodded slowly. You are his father, in every way that matters. He stood up, walked to the door. The rain had started, fine and cold and merciless. He stepped out without a coat. The test result crumpled in his fist. The paper didn't tear, but his heart did. Outside, the street was empty, silent, but inside Marcus's mind, the quiet was deafening. He didn't know what to do next. He only knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Not his marriage, not his understanding of family, not his place in his own home. And somewhere, in the house next door, Ethan slept soundly. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he, too, was lying awake, counting the years and wondering what might have been. But for Marcus, the question wasn't what might have been. It was what to do now, with the truth burning a hole in his pocket and a son upstairs who still called him Dad. There are monsters that don't hide under beds. But next door, wearing a smile and asking for visitation rights. A week after the storm of truth cracked open his world, Marcus received a letter, not an email, not a message through lawyers, but a handwritten envelope dropped into his mailbox like it belonged there. The writing was sharp, familiar. It was Ethan's. I think I have a right to see my son. It read, no threats, no demands, just entitlement dressed as civility. Ethan didn't go through the legal system. He went through Marcus, the man whose life he had already invaded like a slow spreading stain. Marcus held the paper with shaking fingers. then quietly slid it into the drawer with the paternity results. Something in him snapped into stillness. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. If Ethan wanted to stake a claim, Marcus needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. He started with public records. It didn't take long. Ethan had a sealed record in another state, one Marcus could only partially access through contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. There were whispers of disorderly conduct, a DUI arrest, court-mandated rehab. It painted a picture, smudged but menacing, and yet, it wasn't enough, not to stop a custody claim, not to erase blood. So Marcus watched, quietly. He parked down the block and observed Ethan's routines. One afternoon, he saw something chilling. Ethan crouched beside a wounded raccoon in his backyard. Whispering, then, not helping, just watching, smiling, like the pain of the animal amused him. He filmed it, shaky hands, distant audio, but it was something. Still, he needed more. He contacted a private investigator. Someone discreet, someone expensive. Over the next few weeks, the pieces fell into place. Ethan had once lived abroad, in a country with looser laws about digital content. There, under a pseudonym, he operated an online forum that had since been shut down by cybercrime authorities. The material he trafficked in wasn't just illegal. It was vile, the kind of evil you don't speak of, lest it infect the air. The PI found archived metadata, VPN logs, and a buried online alias tied to Ethan. Marcus didn't hesitate. He gathered the evidence and drove to his friend Jonah, now working in the local precinct's cybercrime unit. Jonah read the files, then read them again. His face lost all color. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" Marcus asked. Jonah closed the file. "We'll need to act fast, before he disappears." The raid happened 2 days later. Police descended on Ethan's house just before dawn. They found hard drives, encrypted folders, images no human should have to see. And then, buried deep, videos. Some involved animals, some suggested worse. He didn't resist, he didn't speak, he simply smiled like he was expecting them. When the news broke, Alice collapsed, not from fear, from shame, from the unbearable weight of what she had once loved. Marcus didn't file for divorce. Not yet. He wasn't ready to dismantle the legal scaffolding of his family. But he had terms. Alice would sign over full custodial rights. Her name would not appear on new legal documents for Leo. It was not vengeance. It was control of a situation that had spiraled too far. Ethan was sentenced to 12 years. The court barred him from contact with minors for life. His name would be registered. His house emptied. His past finally, violently, exposed. Marcus sat with Leo one afternoon, watching cartoons. The boy leaned against his shoulder, unaware of the storm he had slept through. "Daddy," he said, yawning, "why doesn't Mr. Ethan come over anymore?" Marcus paused, swallowed hard. He had to go away. Where? Somewhere he belongs. Leo nodded and went back to the screen. The innocence of children is a fragile grace. From that day forward, the name Ethan was never spoken in their house. No photographs, no stories, no memories, a shadow locked in the attic of the past, never to be unpacked again. And every year, on Leo's birthday, Marcus told him stories, not of heroes or dragons, but of choices, of the men we choose to become, and the monsters we learn to bury. Some truths, Marcus had come to understand, weren't meant to be shouted or forgotten. They were meant to be carried, quietly, faithfully, like the weight of a name carved into stone. And the heaviest truth he carried was this: he had chosen to stay. Not for Alice, not out of weakness, but for Leo, for the boy who still reached for his hand when crossing the street. For the little voice that still whispered, "Good night, Dad," without knowing the fractures buried beneath that word. Marcus poured every ounce of love he had into Leo. He helped with homework, built tree houses, coached soccer games even when he barely had the energy to speak. But the truth was, love could not erase the image of a DNA result. It could only make peace with it. And peace, Marcus realized, was not forgetting, it was remembering differently. He began to keep a journal, not one of confessions or rage, but a living document for Leo's future. Lessons he wanted to pass down, warnings about the world, reminders that love, even broken, could still protect. He wrote by lamplight after Leo fell asleep, his words silent echoes of the man he tried to be. Alice tried. She apologized, not just once but every day, in gestures small and desperate. She went to therapy, she volunteered at Leo's school, she made dinners, left notes, waited, but Marcus never allowed her back into the sanctuary of fatherhood. The decisions, school, discipline, future dreams, they were his now, not out of vengeance, but out of instinct. Trust, once shattered, doesn't grow back, it calcifies. Leo, in the meantime, flourished. He was bright, joyful, curious, but sometimes he asked questions. One day, while organizing old photos, he pointed to a picture of the backyard. "Wasn't there a neighbor, the guy who taught me how to spin a soccer ball?" Marcus tensed. He knelt and met Leo's eyes. "Some people are chapters in our past, but not all chapters belong in the book you keep reading." Leo didn't ask again. Each year on Leo's birthday, Marcus would tell a story, not from memory, but from imagination, a fairy tale about a child lost in the woods, and a monster who wore the skin of a man. But in every story, there was always a father, not perfect, not powerful, but unwavering, who stood between the child and the dark. Alice overheard once. She stood outside the door, clutching a tray of cake and drinks that never made it into the room. She didn't interrupt, she just cried, because it was the only truth Marcus would ever let her hear. There was a photo Marcus kept locked away, Ethan. Blurry but unmistakable, and next to it, Leo's updated birth certificate. Clean, unquestionable. Marcus never showed the photo, never mentioned the name. In this house, Ethan had become a ghost exiled from memory. "Dad, do you hate Mom?" Leo asked one evening while washing dishes together. Marcus paused, the sponge frozen mid-scrub. "I was angry," he said slowly, choosing his words like stepping over glass. "Angry enough to leave, but I stayed, because I love you more than I hate anything." Leo dried his hands, then wrapped his arms around his father in a silent, instinctive hug. It said everything words couldn't. In the silence that followed, Marcus felt something shift, not closure, not healing, but the beginning of something that might become both. Sometimes, silence wasn't emptiness, it was grace, and grace, Marcus believed, was how fathers endured. Leo was 22 when he stood in front of his medical school interview panel, wearing a navy suit that fit just a little too tight around the shoulders. He didn't mention the discomfort. He spoke clearly, with a quiet conviction that made the panel lean in. In his application essay, the line that caught everyone's attention wasn't about his grades or his volunteer hours at the hospital. It was the sentence near the end, "My father is not the man who shares my DNA. He is the man who stayed when others walked away." Marcus read that essay days before Leo submitted it. He had found it sitting on the printer, the words still fresh, ink barely dried. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it in the pale morning light. Page after page of his son's heart laid bare. He didn't cry. Marcus had learned to carry emotion in silence. But that night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake with the essay pressed to his chest like a letter from a version of himself he had once hoped to be, and now, somehow, had become. Alice had read it too. She didn't ask Marcus if she could. She simply left him a note. "Thank you for never giving up on him. Even when I gave you every reason to." Time had softened the edges of their wounds. Marcus had never forgotten the betrayal, but he had learned to live beside it, not out of forgiveness, but because Leo's joy was worth more than his own pain. And Alice, she had learned humility in the years since, not through punishment, but through the quiet ache of watching her son flourish in the light of a man she had once nearly destroyed. When the news of Ethan's death reached Marcus, it arrived in a plain letter with no return address. Ethan had died alone in prison. Complications from liver failure. There was no funeral, no body claimed, no name mourned. Marcus didn't tell Leo. Some truths, he believed, were better left buried. He took the envelope, the prison record, and the last photo he'd ever kept of Ethan, and fed them one by one into the fireplace. As the ashes curled upward, Marcus whispered to himself, not with malice, but with finality, "We're done." Leo got married in the spring. The ceremony was simple. White tents in a garden. Strings of soft lights. The smell of jasmine on the breeze. Marcus wore a gray suit. His hair was graying at the temples now. He still moved with the cautious discipline of a man who had once been broken and built himself back piece by piece. Just before the ceremony, Marcus handed Leo a small, framed photograph. It was the very first photo ever taken of the two of them. Leo had been barely 2. In it, he sat on Marcus's lap, eyes wide, hands reaching upward. Marcus's arm was wrapped around him, unsure, yet fiercely protective. Leo held it, blinked twice, and smiled. "This was the day I called you, Dad, wasn't it?" "Yes," Marcus said, his voice quiet. During his wedding speech, Leo didn't speak about love in the way most people did. He didn't thank fate or destiny. He spoke of choice. "I've learned," he said, looking out over the crowd, "that family is not about blood. It's about who shows up. Again and again, even when it's hard. My father chose me, and that choice made me who I am. I don't carry his genes. I carry his legacy." People cried, some clapped, others sat in reverent silence. But Marcus, he simply looked at his son with the stillness of a man who had seen storms and survived them, not with bravado, but with resilience. He didn't need to speak. He had already said everything that mattered, not in words, but in years. Because not all children come from love, but every true father begins with a choice. And Marcus had made his. Again and again, until it became the only truth that mattered. What kind of woman lies during labor, just to make sure her husband misses the birth? In a hospital room full of secrets, the first cry of a baby wasn't the beginning of life. It was the start of betrayal. Martin had always imagined the birth of his first child as a moment of raw beauty and overwhelming joy. He saw himself holding his wife's hand, brushing damp hair from her forehead, whispering strength into her ear as she brought their future into the world. He saw tears, not from pain, but from the kind of love that felt too big for words. That was the dream. The reality was a sterile hallway, a locked door, and silence. Martin, 34, was a civil engineer known for his precision and calm. He approached life like blueprints, with structure, care, and plans that made sense. His wife, Olivia, 32, worked in hospital administration, intelligent, meticulous, always put together. They had met 6 years earlier during a fire drill. Martin admired her competence. Olivia liked his quiet strength. Their marriage, though not perfect, had been steady. They endured financial instability together, supported each other's careers, and finally reached the point they had long hoped for. They were expecting a baby. At first, Olivia glowed with the kind of joy Martin hadn't seen in her before. But something shifted as the pregnancy progressed. She became withdrawn. She skipped joint doctor appointments, citing work or fatigue. She insisted on going to checkups alone, often with her mother instead. She snapped when Martin brought up baby names or asked about the nursery. He chalked it up to hormones, to stress. He didn't press. He wanted to be supportive. Then came the night. Martin was in the middle of designing structural load calculations when he got the call. Olivia's voice was tense. "Something's wrong. I'm going to the hospital. Don't come. They're limiting access due to emergency protocol. Just wait. I'll update you." He froze. "Wait, what do you mean? I'm your husband." "I know," she said quickly, "but they won't let anyone in. Please, Martin, just stay home." He didn't stay home. Martin drove like a man possessed, arriving at the hospital in under 20 minutes. But when he reached the reception, a nurse confirmed Olivia's admittance but refused to let him through. "Emergency obstetric procedure," she said, "only essential personnel." And so he waited 6 hours, on a stiff plastic chair, staring at the motionless elevator doors, checking his phone, pacing, no updates, no calls, no cries through the corridor. He wasn't even allowed near the maternity wing. Eventually, a doctor approached him, white coat, tired eyes. "Congratulations, you have a baby girl." Martin stood up. "Can I see them?" The doctor hesitated. "Your wife is resting. She had a tough delivery. It's best to give her time." No one mentioned the baby's name. No nurse came to offer a wristband. No paperwork, no photos, just nothing. Over the next few days, Olivia stayed in a private maternity room. She refused visitors. Martin came every day, but was told repeatedly she needed rest. When he finally saw her, she looked fragile, yes, but composed. She smiled faintly, but her eyes were guarded. "The baby?" he asked. "With the nurse. Sleeping," she replied. "I'm still overwhelmed. Give me a little space." "Okay." He kissed her forehead. "Anything you need." Weeks passed. Martin wasn't allowed to hold the baby. Olivia claimed she was anxious. That early bonding was stressing her out. She said she needed space, time, healing. Martin tried to be patient. He cooked, he cleaned, he brought flowers. He asked for updates on pediatrician visits, vaccinations. Olivia deflected them all. Then, one rainy morning, Martin reached for Olivia's coat on the chair while tidying up. Something slipped from the inner pocket and fluttered to the floor. A folded sheet of paper. The birth certificate. His hands trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the form. Baby girl, date, hospital, mother, Olivia Bennett, father, unknown, unknown. Martin read it again, and again. His knees gave out, and he sat on the edge of the bed, holding the certificate like it might dissolve. He looked toward the nursery room where Olivia slept peacefully with the baby. Something in him cracked. She had gone through labor, the most intimate, sacred moment of their shared life, and she had chosen to exclude him. But this wasn't just exclusion. This was erasure. She had made sure the system recorded him as a stranger to his own child. That night, Martin lay awake for hours, no longer asking what had gone wrong. He now asked, with icy clarity, what was she hiding? And who was the father that needed to be kept secret so badly? She would stage a fake emergency to shut her husband out of his own bloodline. The search for truth had begun, and it wouldn't be gentle. Martin sat alone in the parked car outside the hospital, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the dashboard, but none of them were as dark as the thoughts clouding his mind. He had missed the birth of his daughter, not by accident, not by fate, but by design. Olivia had ensured it, and now, in the stillness that followed, silence gave way to suspicion. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. The image of that birth certificate with the word unknown under the father's name haunted him like a phantom. It wasn't just a clerical error. It was a message, a declaration that he was, in the eyes of the system, a stranger to his own child. So he did what every desperate man with no answers would do. He searched. Through late nights and early mornings, Martin began quietly asking questions. He knew one of the nurses from Olivia's hospital, a kind woman named Jenna who had always shown a soft spot for his family. He waited until she was alone on her break, approached her gently, respectfully, but the moment he mentioned Olivia's maternity file, her demeanor changed. "I can't, Martin," she said, voice low. "You know I could lose my license." But that night, an email arrived, no subject, no signature, just a line of text: "You deserve the truth." Attached was a scanned report. A page pulled from Olivia's medical file, clinical. Cold, but explosive. The name listed as present in every OB/GYN appointment. Dr. Lionel Garver. Martin knew the name. Everyone in the hospital did. He was the chief attending OB and a man Martin had met once. Briefly, at a staff holiday event. Stomach twisted, Martin confronted Olivia that evening. He didn't shout, his voice didn't rise, but it carried the sharpness of a blade. "Why him?" he asked. "Why not me?" She looked up from the cradle where the baby slept, her expression blank. "You weren't there," she said. "You weren't supposed to be there." It wasn't an answer. It was an indictment. Before Martin could respond, her mother stepped in. Gloria had always been composed, even regal in her self-righteousness. But now, there was a chilling certainty in her voice. "We planned this," she said simply. Martin blinked. "What? 10 years ago, your family turned Olivia away." Gloria continued. "When she was young, pregnant, alone. You remember what your father said? That she wasn't wife material." Martin's mind reeled. He had known about the miscarriage. Vaguely, but Olivia had never told him the full truth. Now he understood. It wasn't just a lost child. It was a wound, and Olivia had carried it like a blade between her ribs ever since. "She lost that baby," Gloria said, "and she lost her dignity. But she kept her resolve." Martin looked back at Olivia. Her face was unreadable. She didn't look proud. She looked empty. It wasn't just revenge. Olivia finally whispered. It was reclamation. "I wanted something of mine. Something that no one could take away." Martin backed away slowly, as though the house itself had become something foreign, something toxic. He left without slamming the door. But he wasn't done. There was still the child. A baby, innocent of its origins, but tied to a web of betrayal and vengeance. Martin needed the truth, legally, genetically, morally, quietly. He collected strands of hair from the infant's hairbrush. He waited a week for the results. When the envelope arrived, he sat alone in the same car outside the hospital. The verdict was swift. 0% probability of paternity. No shared blood. No legal bond. But Martin didn't feel free. He felt haunted. He consulted an attorney, but without his name on the birth certificate. Without proof of intent to claim the child. His rights were legally non-existent. The lawyer's words were precise but merciless. "Unless the mother relinquishes custody, or you prove she committed fraud, there's no path forward." Martin stared down at the test results, then at the photo he had once taken of the baby's tiny hand gripping his finger. The question that lingered wasn't if he'd been betrayed. He had. The question now was how to pursue justice, without inflicting another generation of pain. The baby didn't ask to be born into a war, and Martin, despite everything, wasn't ready to become a man who fought his battles by burning every bridge. So he planned, not for vengeance, but for something more dangerous, the truth. Revealed not in anger, but in patience. It was only the beginning. Martin knew that vengeance often burned hot and reckless. But what he sought now wasn't fire. It was ice, precise, cold, and slow. He would not rush. He would not confront in anger. Because this wasn't just about Olivia anymore. It was about the child, the legacy, and the truth that deserved to be revealed without screaming. And so he began to dig. He contacted a friend from college, now a cybercrime investigator, and asked for a private consultation. Within days, Martin had access to a suite of tools and insights that most ordinary citizens wouldn't know how to use. He sifted through email headers, metadata, document revisions. What he found wasn't just disturbing, it was surgical. The records of Olivia's pregnancy were filled with anomalies, duplicate scans under different patient IDs. File creation times mismatched with appointment logs. Signatures from doctors on days they weren't on shift. And always, buried behind the metadata, the recurring name, Dr. Lionel Garver. It was a name whispered in corridors now. Following Martin's anonymous tip, the hospital's ethics board had opened a quiet internal review. But Martin wasn't waiting for bureaucracy to move. He had already begun recording every interaction with Olivia and her mother, every whispered threat, every manipulative nudge dressed as maternal concern, especially the conversation in which Gloria had told him, with startling pride, she took back what the world denied her. Martin also noticed something strange in the hospital's billing system. Several obstetrics procedures had been filed under unrelated patient names but charged to an internal grant fund, a fund managed by a board on which Garver sat. With mounting documentation, Martin prepared a sealed envelope and sent it to the district attorney's office. Marked confidential. Another went to the state medical licensing board. Then he waited. It took 3 weeks. At 5:32 a.m. on a Thursday, 2 unmarked cars pulled into the hospital's underground parking. By noon, Dr. Garver was escorted out in cuffs. Olivia saw the news on her phone. Standing in the kitchen, cereal box in hand, the bowl slipped from her fingers and shattered. That evening, Martin didn't speak. He handed Olivia a printed sheet of paper, a petition for sole legal custody, citing fraud, emotional endangerment, and falsification of vital records. Attached were the court-stamped DNA results. She didn't fight it. Olivia pled to a lesser charge in exchange for a reduced sentence, probation, mandatory counseling, community service. Garver wasn't so lucky. Years of concealed misconduct came to light. The licensing board revoked his medical license permanently. He was disbarred from practicing medicine in any capacity and faced federal charges for insurance fraud and medical record tampering. And the child? Martin took her home. He fed her, held her, changed her diapers. He sang lullabies he never thought he knew. But he never called her angel or princess. He called her by her name. A name he chose. But in his private journal, where no one could see, he wrote her under a different title. Sorrow. Not out of spite, but because she would forever remind him that some beginnings are built not from love, but from lies. And yet, Martin vowed, she would never bear the cost of that deceit. Because if there was one thing Olivia had underestimated, it was the power of a man who chooses dignity over revenge, and justice over ruin. Martin named her guilt, not out of cruelty, nor poetic spite, but because he refused to pretend the truth had never happened. It wasn't a name he spoke aloud in public, on her school forms, her passport, her daycare records. She was simply Elise. But to Martin, within the sanctuary of his mind and the locked drawer of his heart, she was always guilt, a living, breathing reminder that not every child is born from love. Some, he had learned, are born from vengeance, deception, and bloodless war. He filled out every legal document with ruthless honesty. Father, legal guardian by choice, not blood. There were no romanticized stories about how she was brought into the world. When strangers asked about the mother, he said little. When friends asked if she looked like him, he offered a tight-lipped smile. In truth, Elise didn't resemble him at all. Her hair was ash blonde. Her eyes tilted a certain way. Her voice had a lilt that wasn't his nor Olivia's. But none of that mattered. He had chosen her, and in that choice, Martin found a kind of purpose that had been missing long before the betrayal. Their home was quiet, structured, loving, but never coddling. Elise was fed, dressed in soft clothes, kissed goodnight, but Martin never referred to himself as Daddy. He waited. He believed the title should not be taken, it should be earned. It was a word that should be gifted, not claimed. He kept a respectful distance. Even in affection, never too tight a hug, never too long a stare. The boundary was invisible but present, a fragile wall between the man raising her and the truth about her beginning. On her first birthday, Martin began a tradition. He wrote a letter, just 1 page, folded neatly and dated, explaining, in careful words, a sliver of the truth. The first letter described the day she was born. The second, the false name on the certificate. By the third birthday, he mentioned Olivia. By her fourth, the word, revenge, appeared in ink. These letters he sealed and placed into a fireproof safe in the corner of his bedroom closet. He planned to give them to her when she turned 18, or maybe never, if the burden felt too cruel. But they existed because truth mattered. Even when love had failed, Olivia never returned. After her probation, she moved to Canada, then Germany. Her mother, Gloria, vanished from public records within a year. Martin didn't chase them. He didn't need confrontation anymore. His battlefield was elsewhere now, in parenting with integrity, in living without lies. When Elise was 6, she asked the question he had long feared. Why don't I have a real dad? Like other kids, Martin knelt beside her. He touched her shoulder. "You do have a real dad," he said, "just not the kind who gave you blood. I'm the kind who stayed." She blinked at him. That answer seemed to satisfy her. For now. But Martin knew more questions would come. Harder and sharper. He could only hope his consistency would become her anchor. He never remarried, not because he hadn't had the chance, but because he didn't want to rearrange the fragile balance of the home he had built. Love, to him now, was not about passion or vows. It was about choosing to stay, even when everything inside screamed to run. When Elise turned 12, he took her to the old precinct where Dr. Garver was once processed. The officers there didn't know him. Staff turnover had changed everything, but the walls remembered. He pointed to the plaque honoring civilian informants. His name wasn't there, of course, but he pointed anyway. "This is where I chose to protect you." She looked up at him, eyes wide. She didn't say anything, but she squeezed his hand. That night, for the first time, she called him Dad. It was soft, hesitant, barely audible, but it shattered every wall he had built around his heart. He went to the closet, opened the fireproof safe, and pulled out the letters. He held them in his lap, stared at them, then put them back. Not yet. For now, there was this moment, and it was enough. Guilt grew into his name. Not the whispered one Martin kept locked inside the drawer, but the public name he wore like armor, Elise. But even as he answered to it, his life was shaped by a deeper truth he couldn't yet articulate, that he was both legacy and warning. By the time he turned 27, Elise had become a writer, not a novelist of fantasy or romance, but a chronicler of pain and identity, of what it meant to be born from something broken. His first book, Born from Lies, opened with a dedication that stopped readers cold. "To the man who didn't bring me into this world, but brought me into myself." The book became a phenomenon. Bestseller lists, university curriculums. Reviewers called it brave, brutal, and necessary. But for Martin, now in his early 60s, it was simply his son putting language to the silence they'd lived with for decades. He read the book in one sitting, sitting at the kitchen table where he had once fed Elise mashed bananas and whispered lullabies into the night. He didn't cry until the final page. Then he wept, not because of the pain, but because someone finally understood. Olivia returned 1 month later, not with lawyers, not with demands, but with weathered hands and trembling lips. She stood outside the front gate and waited. Martin never stepped out. Instead, he sent Elise out with a box. Inside it, every letter Martin had written from the day of Elise's birth. The story, the truth, his own failings, his choices, his love, his limits. That night, Elise sat at the edge of his bed, the open box in his lap. "I'll read these when I become a father," he said, "so I never repeat the wreckage we came from." Martin nodded. There was nothing more to say. He died 3 years later. In his will, there were no possessions left to squabble over, only a note, handwritten, folded into a square, tucked into the back of a drawer. Fatherhood is not granted by blood, but by the refusal to walk away. At the funeral, Elise did not speak of betrayal or revenge. He spoke of choice, of presence, of resilience. He quoted the note. He carved those words into the tombstone. No last name, no dates, just, he stayed. In the final interview of his book tour, a journalist asked Elise, "Do you think love born from deception can still be real?" He paused, then said, "I was born from lies. But I was raised in a truth so steady it taught me how to be whole." That's all love really is, isn't it? The choice to stay. The camera light blinked off. The world stayed silent for a beat longer. And then they listened. What if the person you trusted most spoke the darkest truth, in their sleep? And what if your daughter recorded it, without even knowing? This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about a voice never meant to be heard, and the chain reaction it set off. Nathan was the kind of man most would call dependable. Not extraordinary, just steady. He taught high school history in the same small New England town he grew up in. A man of routines, coffee with 2 sugars, tie perfectly knotted, Classroom chalk always white, never colored. His wife, Julia, 37, worked night shifts as a nurse at the city hospital, 12-hour marathons that left her hollow-eyed but determined. And then there was Ava, 8 years old, bright, curious, full of quiet questions, the kind of child who watched more than she spoke, who once asked if the moon ever felt lonely. On Ava's birthday, her maternal grandfather gifted her a smartwatch. It was sleek, soft pink, and packed with features: pedometer, heart rate monitor, voice assistant, and an always-on voice recorder, activated by noise above a certain threshold. Nobody paid much attention to that last detail, not until it was too late. One Friday night, Julia returned from work, exhausted but wound-tight. She lay down beside Ava, who had insisted on a girls' sleepover night in the master bed. Nathan, out grading papers in the kitchen, didn't protest. He welcomed the space. Lately, there had been a tension he couldn't name, something evasive in Julia's eyes when they spoke, a glance that darted away too quickly, an edge in her tone that hadn't always been there. Ava's smartwatch rested on the bedside table, charging. At 2:11 a.m., a faint sound activated the microphone. I should have ended it, if only I had ended it when I could. Then a pause. If I had aborted sooner, maybe I wouldn't be stuck like this. The voice was Julia's, low, slurred with sleep, but unmistakable. 3 minutes of barely coherent murmurs. Names, frustrations, then silence. The watch uploaded the file to the shared family cloud, under a folder titled Audio Clips. The next morning, Nathan opened his email and saw the notification: new audio file uploaded from Ava's smartwatch. Curious. He clicked. His coffee turned bitter in his mouth as Julia's voice filled his earbuds. He listened once, then again, and again, each time hoping he'd misunderstood. But he hadn't. He stared across the kitchen at the closed bedroom door. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder. The world dimmed. His hands trembled. He didn't confront Julia, not yet. He did something worse. He began watching her. He checked her call logs, her text history, what little she hadn't deleted. He mapped her work shifts, searched social media posts, tracked her mood swings. Everything took on a sinister tone. Every smile felt like theater. Every kiss goodnight, a lie rehearsed. But it wasn't betrayal of his marriage that hollowed Nathan. It was betrayal of something more sacred, the love of a parent for their child. To say you wish you had aborted your daughter, and to say it so casually, so bitterly, even in sleep, was a violence he could not explain away. And yet he said nothing. Not to Julia, not to Ava, not even to himself in the mirror. Instead, he buried the truth in a new folder on his laptop, labeled simply, Answers. He knew this was just the beginning. The voice had spoken, and there was no unhearing it. Nathan didn't listen to the recording just once. He listened to it dozens of times, each time hoping his ears had deceived him. But they hadn't. The tone, the phrasing, the exhaustion-tinted cruelty in Julia's voice, it was all real. And it pierced through every foundation of trust they had built over 15 years of marriage. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he forwarded the audio clip to someone who had always been both distant and protective, Julia's mother. Margaret. She was a stern woman, a retired librarian who valued truth over comfort. Her response came within the hour, a single-line reply that read, "Come over, bring Ava." When Nathan arrived, Margaret sat in silence with a cup of untouched tea, her face pale. "I don't know this version of Julia," she said finally. "I don't want to." That night, the recording made its way to Julia's father, Richard. Unlike Margaret, Richard was explosive, a self-made entrepreneur. He had funded Julia's nursing school, bought their first house, even set up a trust fund for Ava. When he heard the audio, he didn't just feel betrayed as a father, he felt deceived as an investor in his daughter's life. Julia was summoned to a family meeting. It wasn't a conversation, it was an inquisition. She arrived defensive, eyes bloodshot, her explanations tangled in deflections. I was exhausted, she insisted. I didn't mean any of it. You know how stress talks through you when you're half asleep. Richard didn't buy it. Within 48 hours, he began the legal processes to sever Julia from every financial tether he controlled. Bank accounts were locked, credit cards declined, the house deed was quietly restructured. Julia woke up one morning to find her car repossessed and her healthcare license under review due to an anonymous tip citing mental instability. Nathan, meanwhile, had been quietly preparing his exit. He filed for divorce and sole custody of Ava. The evidence was irrefutable, and while Julia fought back with public tears and private threats, the court saw through her. Her visitation rights were restricted to supervised meetings twice a month. Eventually, she stopped showing up altogether. Ava was 8, and though she couldn't grasp the legal language or the adult betrayals, she began asking simpler, sharper questions. Why doesn't Mom want to live with this anymore? Or, was I a mistake? Nathan didn't have answers, so he gave her what he could: presents, morning pancakes, walks to school, bedtime stories about brave girls and the fathers who never left them. He deleted the recording but kept the pain, folding it into his resolve. Julia disappeared into the outskirts of the city, living in a one-bedroom apartment with blackout curtains and too much wine. The silence from Ava stung more than any court order. She tried sending gifts, but Ava never opened them. Her name faded from household conversations like a myth no one wanted to retell. Ava became fascinated with devices. Not in the usual way. She wasn't gaming or glued to social media. She studied them, how smartwatches detected movement, how cloud backups worked, how voices could be indexed, searched, and resurrected. Nathan noticed but never interfered. In her quiet obsession, she had found a form of therapy. And in that therapy, a seed of something else began to grow, not bitterness, not vengeance, but purpose. A cloud once filled with a mother's careless words had become Ava's private sky of truths. She had learned that technology could forget nothing. And someday, neither would she. Ava was 18 when she realized her father had only told her half the story. By then, she was already 2 years into her cybersecurity degree, thriving in a program that she had outpaced in months. Professors praised her as gifted. She wasn't just good with code. She understood it the way artists understood brushstrokes. There was beauty in silence, in fragments, in the spaces between what people say and what machines record. And perhaps that's why the old audio file, the one her father said had changed their lives, never quite left her mind. The 3-minute clip had become something like a family relic. Nathan never explicitly told her what it meant, only that it was the reason her mother left. And that some truths weren't meant for children. But Ava had always wondered. The line about wishing she had aborted, a line that still rang like a ghost inside her head, seemed like it had come from the middle of something. Like a scream pulled out of a longer cry. So, one winter night, she went digging. She booted up her old smartwatch, still miraculously functional, and synced it to a restored cloud backup she had reverse-engineered from residual metadata on an outdated server. It took 4 hours and a custom Python script. But eventually, she found it, 6 audio files, all timestamped within a 90-minute window that night 10 years ago. She listened to them alone, in her dark bedroom, the glow of her laptop painting her face pale blue. And there it was, her mother's voice again. But not just regret. Fear. I can't let Nathan find out. If he knows about what I did with him, it'll destroy everything. Ava froze. With him? Who was him? The next file had background noise. The rustling of sheets. Her mother's breath hitching. Quiet. Almost inaudible. But then another voice. Male. Faint. Not Nathan's. That's when the question flipped. What had her father hidden from her? She began watching him more carefully. Her father, once her hero, now a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He was meticulous, calm, a creature of routine, but he never let her near his old electronics, never left his phone unattended. And once, just once, she heard him talking in hushed tones in the garage to a man she didn't recognize. The words were clipped, purposeful. The files are gone, but she's curious again, so delete what's left. We can't let her dig. Ava didn't sleep that night. She broke into his old laptop the next day. It took her 15 minutes. Hidden in a locked folder was a cache of voice memos and image files. Some were benign, others weren't. One showed a burned-out car frame in a wooded area, time-stamped almost exactly 10 years ago. Another file, an audio memo, had her father's voice, calm, resolved, handled, no loose ends. Her breath caught. The pieces began to fall into place. The next morning, the news ran a story about a cold case reopening. A man named Vincent Hale, ex-boyfriend of Julia, her mother, had died in a suspicious vehicle fired 10 years ago. New forensic technology had uncovered inconsistencies. The police were looking into past connections. Ava didn't tell her father what she knew. Not yet. Instead, she reached for the old smartwatch. The one that had started it all. She modified it, added new firmware, a silent trigger, and linked it to an encrypted server only she controlled. Then she waited for the right moment. This time, the confessions wouldn't come in whispers. They would come in high fidelity. And this time, she would be the one recording the truth. The software Ava installed onto her smartwatch wasn't available to the public. It was something she had engineered herself, an voice capture program capable of tagging and analyzing tone, stress levels, and inconsistencies in speech. It wasn't designed for casual surveillance. It was designed to listen deeply. Each night, the device sat innocuously on her wrist as she moved through the house with silent intention. Syncing seamlessly with her laptop in the bedroom. She told her father it was for fitness tracking. He had no reason to doubt her. For 3 weeks, she waited. 3 weeks of mundane conversations, quiet dinners, predictable routines, and lonely mutterings from Nathan as he folded laundry or stared out the window. Then, late one night, the AI flagged a whisper. It wasn't just tone, it was what was said. She can never know. That's buried. 10 years ago, we made sure. The voice was Nathan's. He was alone. He had no idea the walls were listening. Ava's fingers trembled as she replayed the segment. Then, a name appeared, another voice in the background. Older, hoarser, Raymond. Ava had no memory of him, but she found him in an archived hospital staff list. Raymond, night guard, worked the maternity wing, quit shortly after Ava's birth. That same night, Ava compiled everything, every flagged phrase, every compressed data packet, and uploaded it to a secure whistleblower platform run by a non-profit journalistic consortium. She encrypted it 3 times. Then she hit send. Within 24 hours, the house changed. It wasn't the silence, it was the arrival of noise. Sirens, commands, a knock that wasn't a knock but a declaration. Police raided their home with forensic warrants. Nathan didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply raised his hands. Among the items seized, a folder marked Maternity, Confidential, 3 USB drives, and a journal Ava had never seen, handwritten, leather-bound, and locked. Meanwhile, across the city, a social worker tracked down Julia. She had vanished into herself. But not off the grid. Her name still existed, floating quietly behind support group rosters and pharmacy records. She agreed to testify, no longer combative, just empty. The grand jury convened within days. Charges were formal: tampering with evidence, aiding and abetting obstruction of justice, and criminal negligence resulting in death. It wasn't just one man burned in that car a decade ago. It was what he knew, what he threatened to expose. Nathan's defense was weak. Raymond denied everything until shown transcripts and vocal prints. The case began to right itself. Then came the final blow. A clip, sent anonymously. In it, Ava sat before a camera. 18 now, straight posture, no makeup, no performance. When I was 8, she began, my mother whispered something in the dark. And the world changed. 10 years later, I gave my father the same chance. I listened. Now, it's your turn. The room fell to silence when the clip ended. Ava never named herself. But everyone knew who she was. Her parents' daughter, the one whose birth had been bathed in lies. The one who now used truth as her only inheritance. Nathan looked down. Julia didn't meet anyone's gaze. Both rendered mute, not by guilt alone, but by the sound of a voice that had finally spoken for itself. And Ava, somewhere far away, shut her laptop. It was enough. Ava was no longer the daughter of Julia or Nathan. She was the daughter of recordings, of whispers saved, of truths buried and unearthed by data. She didn't belong to bloodlines or family trees. She belonged to the cloud, to the chain of digital echoes that had made her who she was. In the years after the trial, Ava became a public figure in an entirely different way. Not as a celebrity, not as a survivor, but as a voice. She pursued degrees in cybersecurity, digital forensics, and ethics. Her thesis, Inherited Deceit, the ethical ownership of family data. It became required reading in several universities. She traveled the world speaking not just about technology, but about morality, about silence, about how modern betrayal didn't need bruises or broken vows, only a forgotten backup folder. An accidental sync. On the TEDx stage in Berlin, she said to a packed audience, "My parents taught me a single truth: never trust the silence. The world records us more than we know, and sometimes, what it captures isn't a crime, until it's played back." The applause that followed wasn't for pain, but for clarity. Ava wrote a book titled Echoes of the Cloud. It was a memoir, but also a manifesto. In one of the final chapters, she wrote, "Blood speaks softly, but data never forgets." Julia lived her last years in a psychiatric care facility, diagnosed with severe dissociative disorder. She spent her days rereading old medical notes and mumbling to people no longer alive. No one visited, not even staff unless required. Nathan died in prison. The official cause was never released. Some speculated suicide. Others said he never adapted to confinement. Ava received a call from the warden. She said, "Thank you for letting me know," and hung up. She didn't ask for a funeral notice. She didn't attend, not his, not her mother's. When it came, she left no flowers, no messages, but every year on her birthday, Ava opened her laptop and sent a single email. To herself. Subject line, "Log it. Don't forget, Netflix called once, then HBO." A studio from Seoul offered to dramatize her childhood. She declined them all. "I don't need to be watched," she said. "I need to preserve the quiet. The right kind of quiet." And still, on her wrist, was the same smartwatch, a different strap now, sleeker, adult, but the device was the same one that, years ago, had captured her mother's midnight whisper and changed the course of 3 lives. It no longer recorded, but it didn't need to. It was a relic, a reminder, a silent totem that told her every day, "Listen closely. Every truth begins as a whisper." What happens when a single needle, meant to save a child's life, instead shatters the very foundation of a family? That night, it wasn't blood that broke them apart. It was truth, cold, clinical, undeniable. Martin was a man of structure, both in profession and in life. At 40, the architect had built more than just homes. He had built a world around stability, brick by brick, plan by plan. His wife, Sarah, 38, had been part of that blueprint for the last 15 years. And Noah, their 8-year-old son, was the heart of that structure. His laughter echoed through the corridors Martin designed. His drawings cluttered the fridge doors like art galleries of innocence. But on that storm-racked evening, as lightning fractured the sky and sirens sliced through the wet silence, Martin's carefully built world began to tremble. A car, a screech, a call from a neighbor. Then the rush to the emergency room with Noah unconscious, pale, broken in the backseat of an ambulance. In the fluorescent sterility of the hospital, a different kind of fracture emerged. "He needs blood," the attending physician said, voice taut with urgency. "We'll test both of you, just in case." Martin nodded, barely breathing. He held Sarah's hand tighter than ever, until her fingers went limp. Minutes turned into an hour. Then too, a nurse called Martin aside. Her face practiced in neutrality. "Mr. Lewis," she began carefully, "we've run the compatibility panel. You're not a match." He blinked. "That's impossible. I'm O negative. I should match anyone." "That's what we thought too," she said, "so we ran a secondary cross-match. And also did a rapid paternity test. We needed to confirm something." Martin's spine turned to ice. "You're not Noah's biological father." There wasn't anger at first. Just silence. A heavy, slow-forming silence that clamped his ribs and refused to let go. Sarah stood by the vending machine when he returned. Oblivious. When their eyes met, she seemed to understand immediately. "You heard?" she asked. Her voice barely audible. "Say it," he said, tone flat as concrete. She shook her head, then nodded. Tears welled up, too quickly to be called spontaneous. "It was one night," she whispered. "We were going through a rough patch. I never meant for." "Does he know?" Martin interrupted. "No. God, no. He thinks you're his father. You are his father." Martin walked away before she could finish the sentence. The days that followed blurred into one another. He moved into a hotel. Ate when he remembered. Slept in short, angry bursts. But each evening, he returned to the hospital. Sat by Noah's bed. Read aloud from his favorite storybooks. The boy smiled weakly, unaware that something inside his father had unraveled. Martin studied Noah's features now with forensic intensity. Was that nose his? The dimple, the laugh that came too easily. He hated himself for even questioning. But the doubt was like acid. It didn't burn all at once. It corroded slowly. Sarah texted, called, begged, but Martin responded only once. "Is there more you haven't told me?" She replied, "No, it was just the one night. Please believe me." He didn't. One truth had already surfaced. But Martin knew, deep down, in the cold engineering part of his soul, that structures don't collapse from one crack. They fall when hidden fractures finally reach daylight. And so he made a decision, not to forgive. Not yet, but to investigate. Not every betrayal begins in a bedroom. Some begin under bright hospital lights, with a needle meant to save a life, and a result that ends another. Martin stood at the threshold of a truth more disorienting than any betrayal. In the quiet hours of dawn, while Noah was still asleep under a blanket of hospital light and beeping monitors, Martin dropped a small envelope onto a metal desk at the back of the lab. Inside, a strand of his mother's hair, carefully taken from her hairbrush. He hadn't asked for permission. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words, "I need to know if this child is your grandson." The results came back quickly. Clinical, cold, definitive. There was no genetic match between Martin's mother and Noah. For a man who once designed concert halls and museums, cathedrals of order, light, and meaning, Martin now stood inside a cathedral of chaos. Nothing resonated anymore. Every wall echoed with questions. Why had Sarah lied? Why had she told him the child was born from infidelity? Why hadn't she told him the truth? Even if that truth was stranger than the first. Driven by desperation more than clarity, Martin called an old college friend, now a lawyer, to help him access Sarah's fertility records. The path was legal, but barely. Martin never intended to sue. He just needed to understand what Sarah had done and why she'd hidden it from him. The law was just a ladder to the truth. He learned that 9 years ago, Sarah had visited a private fertility clinic known for discretion. IVF, frozen embryos, anonymous donors. But the donor code listed for Noah caught his eye, alphanumeric. But familiar, too familiar, it echoed something in him. Memory, long buried under layers of domestic routine, rose like floodwater. A decade earlier, Martin had donated sperm to a private clinic. He had just turned 30. It was a different time. He and Sarah had broken up temporarily after a miscarriage. She had withdrawn. He had shut down. Donating had seemed abstract, harmless, a gesture of control in a world that had offered him none. He contacted the clinic under a pretense, posing as a man curious to know if any of his biological children had been born. The process required paperwork, validation, and patience. But when the match came back, it carried a quiet thunder. Noah was indeed his biological son. Not a result of an affair. Not the child of another man. But his own. He dropped the paper, not out of shock, but grief. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the exclusion. Sarah had taken from him not only the truth but the experience of choosing. She had decided to become a mother on her own terms. Even if the genetic material came from Martin, she had removed him from the equation. Not physically, but psychologically. She made him a donor, not a father. When Martin confronted Sarah, her face was a blend of defiance and exhaustion. She explained that after their miscarriage, she had lost faith in him, in marriage, in shared futures. She had wanted control, agency, and certainty. When she found his donor file, she made what she called a clean decision, to have a child who carried his genes but not his permission. "I didn't want to ask for something you weren't ready to give," she said. "I wanted Noah to be mine. But I still wanted him to be yours." Martin couldn't respond. There were no words to answer a paradox. How do you reconcile being the father of a child you were never allowed to father? In the days that followed, he watched Noah with a new kind of ache. Every laugh, every question, every innocent glance now bore the weight of complexity. He wasn't a stranger's son. He was his son, but he had been born from silence, not from love spoken aloud. And Martin realized, knowing the truth didn't heal. It deepened the wound. Martin stood at the threshold of his home, the door creaking open not with welcome, but with the weight of history pressing inward. The air was no longer familiar. Each room felt like a theater set, recognizable, yet false. Sarah greeted him with a hopeful tension, her voice low and cautious, like someone trying to coax forgiveness out of a storm. But Martin said nothing about forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, a quiet stillness between them, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of ceramic as she set down his coffee. There were no accusations, no tears, only silence, the kind that carries the density of 1,000 questions. And Sarah, perhaps misreading the silence as permission, began to speak. "I did what I thought was right," she said. "I wanted Noah to have a father like you. I didn't know if you'd ever want to try again after what happened, but I knew you'd be good to him. So I made sure it was you." Martin stared at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. Her words felt like a scalpel, clean, precise, and unapologetic. In her mind, she had done something noble. She had preserved the image of a family while manipulating its foundation. He began to question everything he once understood about fatherhood. Was it biology that made him a father? Or consent? Was love enough to retroactively sanctify deceit? The lines blurred. The man who had once drawn blueprints for skyscrapers now struggled to outline the borders of his own role. Was he a builder of lives or just a donor of cells? Martin began therapy, not to fix the marriage, but to anchor himself. He chronicled his thoughts in a journal he titled, "The Child I Didn't Choose." Page after page, he unraveled knots of resentment, confusion, sorrow, and shame. He wasn't angry at Noah, he couldn't be. But he also couldn't pretend that everything was unbroken. Sarah kept defending her decision with a casual certainty that struck him as dangerous. "If I'd told you, you would have said no, so I did it alone. But it was still your child." It wasn't a confession, it was a manifesto. Eventually, Martin began sleeping in the guest room. Then he stopped sleeping in the house altogether. He loved Noah, but the house had become unlivable, not physically, but philosophically. How could he remain where every truth had been plastered over with beautiful lies? Noah's birthday arrived like a storm dressed in balloons. Martin hosted a party with quiet grace, lighting candles, handing out slices of cake, smiling at photos being taken. But when the guests left and the boy was asleep, Martin sat alone in the kitchen, the last candle still flickering. He whispered, "Happy birthday, son," to no one but himself. The next morning, he filed for divorce. His petition cited emotional manipulation, medical deception, and unilateral parenthood as grounds. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the architecture of boundaries. Sarah fought back. In court, she clung to sentiment, memories, milestones, and a child who knew no other father. But Martin had more than sentiment. He had evidence, documentation, the support of psychologists who testified about the emotional erosion he had endured. The therapist spoke of Sarah's control, her justifications, her refusal to acknowledge Martin's autonomy. When the judgment came, it was swift. The court declared Martin both biological and legal father, not just because of the DNA, but because of his enduring presence, his commitment, his choice. And Sarah lost custody. Martin walked out of the courthouse not triumphant, but hollow. He had won nothing except the right to start again. A new home, built this time not on secrets, but on truth, however painful, however incomplete. He took Noah's hand. They stepped out into the sunlight. There were still shadows, but they no longer lived inside the walls. Martin moved through the routines of fatherhood like a man carefully repairing a bridge while crossing it. He packed Noah's lunch, helped with homework, tied shoelaces, and kissed the boy's forehead each night. But something always stood between him, a silence not of neglect, but of containment. Love was present, but not free. It was measured, weighed, and silently negotiated. Each year, on Noah's birthday, Martin followed the same ritual. After the guests left and Noah fell asleep with frosting still on his cheek, Martin would sit alone in the dim kitchen, a single candle flickering on a leftover slice of cake. No audience, no celebration. He'd lean forward and whisper, "Happy birthday," to the gift no one asked for, and I couldn't return. He never told Noah the full truth, not out of fear, but from a conviction that some knowledge was not a birthright, but a burden. He believed that protecting Noah's innocence was the only way to preserve what little dignity the boy's origin story still held. That perhaps love, when given freely, could rewrite the past. Noah, for his part, never pried. He was an observant child, emotionally attuned, sensitive in a way that bordered on intuitive. He seemed to sense the unspoken history woven into his father's tired smile. Yet he never pushed. It was as if he understood that their family, however fractured in its foundation, held together by a quiet resilience. One evening, while cleaning out Noah's backpack, Martin found a school essay titled, "Why I Believe in Good People." In it, Noah wrote, "My dad is the reason I believe kindness is real. Not because he says it, but because he chooses it every day." Martin read those words and wept, not the dramatic weeping of catharsis, but the broken, grateful tears of a man whose heart had been quietly repairing itself without him knowing. In that moment, his grief found a mirror, and in that reflection, he saw not loss, but redemption. Sarah, once the architect of this complicated fate, had vanished. No calls, no letters. Her absence was not a wound anymore. It was simply a fact. Martin never spoke ill of her. When Noah asked, he simply replied, "Everyone has reasons, so do I." He took subtle steps toward formalizing their bond. He changed Noah's surname to his own, signed the papers at City Hall with a steady hand, and framed the certificate. It wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. A name, chosen not by blood, but by love. Their life settled into a quiet rhythm, a house of soft music, weekend bike rides, and unsaid understandings. They didn't speak of beginnings. They lived in the now. And in that space, they were more than survivors of a betrayal. They were architects of something more honest. In the stillness of a late autumn evening, as father and son watched leaves fall from the porch, Noah leaned his head against Martin's shoulder. "You always stayed," he said. Martin didn't reply. He didn't need to, because sometimes, truth doesn't need to be named. It just needs to be lived. Noah's acceptance letter arrived on a gray morning, tucked between utility bills and grocery coupons. Martin unfolded it slowly, his fingers trembling, not from surprise but from the strange symmetry of it all. Bioethics. Of all the fields Noah could have chosen, he chose the one that dealt with questions Martin himself had drowned in for over a decade. It felt like the universe had a dark sense of humor, sending a boy born from silence into a world where truth and deception were dissected for moral clarity. Martin sat down that evening with his journal, the one he had begun during his first therapy session, titled, "The Child I Didn't Choose." With a pen heavy from years of ink and emotion, he wrote one final line: "You came from manipulation, but you were raised through choice." There was nothing else to say. The pages were full. The burden had shifted. It was no longer Martin's truth to carry. It belonged to Noah now. A week later, a letter arrived with Sarah's handwriting. The envelope was pale blue, unassuming, like the calm before a storm. Martin didn't open it right away. He knew it wasn't for him. It was for a version of him that no longer existed. She wanted to meet, to explain, to say goodbye properly, but Martin did not respond. Instead, he unlocked the fireproof safe where years of secrets slept. He took out the IVF documents, the donor forms, the appointment logs, and the DNA results. He sealed them in a new envelope, along with a letter addressed to Noah. "When you're old enough to understand, you deserve to know, not because it will change who you are, but because it may change what you choose to carry." On the day of Noah's graduation, Martin sat in the third row, his heart pounding louder than any applause. Noah stood at the podium, tall, confident, with a quiet fire in his eyes. "My father," he began, "is the only person in my life who never left, even though he never chose to begin." Martin bit his lip, blinking rapidly. He turned his face away so no one would see the tears. That night, as the sky held its breath over a city of glowing street lamps, Martin burned the IVF file, not out of denial, not to erase the past, but to ensure it would never be used to harm, manipulate, or define. He watched the pages curl and blacken, then turned to Noah, who was setting out 2 plates and lighting candles on a modest birthday cake. They sat together in silence, eating chocolate frosting and laughing over nothing. For the first time in years, Martin didn't whisper a solitary wish. He had nothing left to wish for. Later, as the cake disappeared and the candles melted into stubs, Noah asked, "Dad, was I born out of love?" Martin paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth was finally simple. "Not back then," he said softly, "but now, absolutely." In the quiet afterward, something unspoken settled in the space between them. There are truths that don't need to be known to be lived. And there are fathers who were never chosen, but still become the kind that love makes worthy.